Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, fire wasn't a convenience. It was everything. Heat, cooking, light protection, and possibly your only friend during a week-long storm in a thatched hut. So when you left home, you didn't pack snacks. You packed fire. Enter the portable fire bundle, the medieval version of a Zippo lighter. If that lighter was slow, smelled like sheep, and could burn your entire cart down if handled badly, here's how it worked. You take a glowing ember from your home hearth, typically charcoal, and wrap it inside dried moss, fungus, or punkwood, often stuffed into a hollowed-out horn or a fireproof leather pouch. Sometimes it was wrapped in linen soaked in saltpeter or animal fat for longer smoldering. The ember would smolder for hours, sometimes even an entire day, ready to be revived with a bit of breath and some gentle coaxing, much like your self-esteem after a peasant tax audit. The whole bundle was lightweight, reusable, and vital. It saved you from the misery of having to strike sparks from flint and steel for 30 minutes straight while pretending you knew what you were doing. Fire making was notoriously fickle, especially if your tinder got damp or your hands were frozen into sad little claws. Carrying fire meant you could walk into a clearing, build a shelter, unpack your moss-wrapped miracle, and with a puff of breath and a prayer to Saint Smokey of the Ember, have flames ready for soup, warmth, or dramatic shadow puppet storytelling. You could even hand one to a neighbor on their way to market, passing the literal torch because no one liked being the guy who had to beg for fire at dusk. Socially awkward and occasionally met with should have packed your moss, Gerald. If you've ever looked at a prepper pantry, it's basically a museum of vacuum-sealed ambition. Jerky beans, mystery cans from 2011, and enough freeze-dried stroganoff to survive a small apocalypse and still complain. But medieval folks, they preserved meat the old-fashioned way, with smoke, salt, and the quiet terror of having nothing to eat come February. Now, most people today think of smoking meat as something you do with a grill, a beer, and mild barbecue delusions. But in the Middle Ages, smoke wasn't for flavor. It was for survival. And not just any smoke. This was strategic, sneaky smoke, hidden smoke. You see, in many homes, especially cottages with open hearths, meat wasn't displayed proudly above the fire like in a fantasy movie. It was hung behind the fire, tucked high up in rafters, out of reach from animals, children, and that one neighbor who always showed up at dinner. Why behind the fire? Because that's where the cool smoke drifted, slow and steady, rising through the house and wrapping itself around whatever unfortunate chicken or pig part you'd managed to obtain. Over days, weeks, and even months, the smoke would dry the meat, kill off bacteria, repel insects, and make sure your ham survived longer than your New Year's optimism. This wasn't your sweet applewood barbecue kind of smoke. This was pine and despair smoke, thick, acrid, and full of character. After a few months, the meat was hardened, darkened, and fully armed against decay, bugs and relatives dropping in unexpectedly. Even better, hidden meat smoked slower and was harder to steal. That matters when you live in a village where I didn't see your sausage hanging there is somehow a legal defense. And don't forget the dual benefit. While the meat smoked, the house stayed warm and pest-resistant. Nothing says cozy medieval evening like sitting under a smoldering ham in a room filled with smoke and hope. Today's preppers love perimeter defense, motion sensors, tripwires, camera drones, and that one guy who always insists his dog can smell looters from a mile away. But medieval folks had their own version of property defense. And it didn't require batteries, barking, or Wi-Fi. It was called a living fence. And yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. Imagine trying to keep your cows in and your neighbor's children out without using lumber, nails, or yelling. The solution? Grow your wall. Living fences, also called hedgerows, were created by planting fast-growing bendy trees like willow, hawthorn, hazel, or blackthorn close together as they grew. You didn't just let them shoot upward like overachieving weeds. No, you bent, wove, and interlaced the branches into a thick, snarling hedge that could stop a pig, redirect a goose, and absolutely ruin a thief's evening. It wasn't just effective. It was elegant, in a spiky, borderline violent sort of way. Some hedges were laid, meaning the trunks were partially cut and bent sideways, encouraging new growth while still alive. Others included thorny plants that doubled as burglar deterrents and a free berry source, assuming you had the hands of a masochist. And here's the beauty of it. Living fences grew stronger over time. Unlike wooden fences that rot, collapse, and invite every carpenter in town to give you a quote, hedgerows became thicker, denser, and more impenetrable each year. Medieval farmers weren't just building walls, they were cultivating fortresses. They also served multiple roles. Birds nested in them, pollinators loved them, and they prevented soil erosion. Basically, they were medieval multi-tools. If your multi-tool had thorns, bees, and the occasional hidden ferret, they were also beautiful. Some hedgerows still visible in England today are over 700 years old, meaning they've outlived wars, kings, and several attempts at Brexit when you hear clay batteries. You might imagine monks in pointy hats zapping frogs with static, or medieval peasants accidentally inventing the Tesla. But no, this kind of battery had nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with temperature control. Long before thermostats, mini fridges, or the phrase climate anxiety, clay, as it turns out, is not just for pots, questionable sculptures, and preschool. In the medieval world, it was also an unspoken genius of thermal mass, which is a fancy way of saying it holds on to heat or cold, like a stubborn grandmother holds on to grudges. Let's break it down. Medieval homes and food storage pits often used clay-lined vessels or walls to regulate temperature. In the summer, clay kept food cooler than the surrounding air. In the winter, it retained heat longer than most building materials. This wasn't science fiction, it was just physics with mud. People would store milk, butter, or stew in unglazed clay pots soaked in water. As the water evaporated from the porous surface, it cooled the contents, kind of like a medieval refrigerator, but cheaper, quieter, and less likely to make your leftovers taste like Freon. Some even buried clay pots in cellars or shaded pits, where the Earth's steady underground temperature helped preserve food, drinks, and sometimes grandma's emergency apple pie. They could also be heated near a fire, then used to slowly release warmth through the night. Clay bricks were placed in beds under cloaks, or even wrapped in wool and carried on wagons, the medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle, but earthlier. And unlike modern batteries, these never exploded. At worst, they just cracked and quietly gave up. If you've ever cursed at a pan because your eggs decided to permanently fuse with it, you might appreciate Teflon. But if you lived in the Middle Ages, long before non-stick coatings and late-night infomercials, you relied on something far simpler and far more blister-inducing friction glaze. Yes, medieval folks actually polished their cookware by hand to create a smooth, semi-resistant surface that helped reduce food sticking. It wasn't magic and it wasn't perfect, but it worked surprisingly well, especially if your expectations were already shattered by a lifetime of cabbage-based disappointments. Here's how it worked. Pottery, especially cookware, was usually made of coarse clay, which is about as non-stick as sandpaper. But by rubbing the still damp pots with smooth stones, bone tools, or even hardwood, they compressed the surface, aligning particles and sealing pores. This painstaking polishing created a subtle shine known as a burnished glaze. Imagine someone spending half a day massaging a soup pot like it owes them money. That's friction glaze. Now, did this stop everything from sticking? No, this wasn't a miracle. It was a medieval innovation, but it reduced food adhesion enough to make cleaning easier and stew less crusty. Some even coated their burnished pots with a thin layer of animal fat, then fired them to help seal the surface. A kind of prehistoric seasoning process. It also helped the pots last longer by making them more resistant to water and cracking. And for extra points, burnished pots looked nicer. In a time when most things were gray, wooden, or dying, a shiny cooking pot was basically the medieval equivalent of kitchen bling. Of course, the process was labor-intensive and likely gave many potters permanent shoulder problems, but it meant the difference between usable cookware and a vessel that turned porridge into plaster. Modern preppers might spend hundreds on titanium cookware or whatever the latest anti-stick miracle is. But medieval folks, they sat down, grabbed a rock, and just kept rubbing until the pot obeyed. Primitive. Maybe. Effective. Absolutely. Long before GPS, Google Maps, and that one friend who swears he knows a shortcut and absolutely doesn't. People had to navigate using their ears, especially in fog or forests, or those charming medieval mornings when the mist was so thick you couldn't see your own cartwheel. Enter the lost art of sound navigation. Not a superpower, not echolocation by bat, but practical survival through careful listening. And frankly, we don't give our ancestors enough credit for this. These were people who could identify their village by the angle of a church bell, and determine how lost they were by how many dogs were barking. Let's say you're traveling on foot. No compass, no landmarks, just fog, mud, and a deep suspicion that you're walking in circles. You tune your ears to the bells, church bells, cowbells, even strategically placed clappers or gongs in certain regions. Towns often rang their church bells not just for mass, but as auditory lighthouses. Sound that cut through the mist and reminded you that civilization still existed somewhere. Herds were often equipped with cowbells or sheep bells, not just so you could find them again when they wandered off to commit mischief, but so you could follow the noise back home, assuming you didn't follow the wrong herd and end up in Gerald's pasture again. Forests and passes sometimes had wind chimes, clanging pots, or drums hung from trees to help mark trails. A clatter on the wind meant you were going the right way, or at least a way that someone had gone before and possibly survived. Fishermen used horns and echoes to find harbor entrances. Travelers would shout, clap, or bang sticks to judge distances by echo return. Primitive sonar, minus the wetsuit. Even taverns helped. Many had musicians or loud gossip that spilled into the street like a beacon of ale-fueled safety. Follow the loot and you'd find warmth, food, and possibly your cousin passed out under a bench. Like you lived in the Middle Ages and wanted to keep your teeth from rotting out of your skull prematurely. You had one go to charcoal. Not toothpaste, not floss, just burned stuff. Medieval people didn't exactly have Colgate. What they had was charred wood, ground into powder and mixed with salt, dried herbs, or crushed shells. Applied directly to the teeth using fingers, sticks, or in the case of the particularly fashion-forward, a rag tied around a twig. This rustic blend became a sort of tooth scrub that could polish enamel, remove food buildup, and maybe, if the saints were kind, delay total tooth collapse until your 40s. Now, was it pleasant? Absolutely not. Rubbing gritty ash against your teeth feels exactly how it sounds. Like chewing sand during a bonfire. But it was better than the alternative, which was to let plaque party freely until your gums staged a violent revolt. Charcoal also had mild antibacterial properties, meaning it helped fight bad breath. Sort of. Fresh breath in the medieval context meant you could speak within 3 feet of someone without causing tears. Some recipes added mint, rosemary, or sage, not for effectiveness, but for the illusion of hygiene. Others swore by vinegar rinses afterward, which likely undid any good the charcoal did and added a nice enamel melting bonus. Dental work, when things went bad, involved pliers, strong arms, and a total absence of anesthesia. So yes, smearing ashes on your molars suddenly looked like a very attractive alternative. Today, charcoal has made a comeback in hipster toothpaste and spa treatments. But let's be clear, medieval folks didn't use it to be trendy. They used it because the only other option was having your teeth pulled by a guy named Bartholomew, who also sharpened knives. Let's be honest, modern housing is mostly drywall, concrete, and IKEA furniture that collapses if you even think about leaning on it wrong. But medieval peasants? They built homes out of sticks, mud, straw, and sheer optimism. The method? It was called wattle and daub, which sounds like a quirky folk band, but was actually the backbone of everyday survival architecture. Here's how it worked. First, you start with wattle, which is just a fancy word for woven branches, twigs, or long flexible sticks. Think basket weaving, but taller, colder, and way more likely to collapse on your goat. These wattle panels were then fastened between wooden posts, creating what looked like the skeleton of a very confused fence. Next came the daub, a charming hand-mixed concoction of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. Yes, daub. Because in the Middle Ages, if it wasn't at least partially made of poop, were you even trying? This delightful paste was smeared into the wattle and left to dry, forming a surprisingly strong insulated wall. It kept out the wind, held in heat, and provided the kind of rustic scent that said home, sweet, slightly composting home. Now it wasn't glamorous. Your walls might occasionally crack, flake, or attract curious chickens, and patching them up was just part of your weekly to-do list right between don't starve and yell at the neighbor's goat. But it was cheap, effective, and best of all, locally sourced. No shipping fees, no carbon footprint, just earth, labor, and possibly a little trauma. Despite how primitive it sounds, wattle and daub could last decades, even centuries, with maintenance. Some medieval homes still standing today have their original wattle walls, which means some peasant in 1350 did a better job than your last contractor. Picture medieval bedtime, a rickety straw mattress stuffed with regret, a thatched roof dripping something suspicious, and the constant threat of fleas, lice, and things that buzz, bite, or crawl with suspicious confidence. Enter the surprisingly elegant solution: herb lace bedding, a rustic blend of aromatherapy and pest control. Invented not because they were fancy, but because medieval peasants didn't want to wake up as a banquet for parasites. You see, stuffing your mattress with plain straw was just asking for company. The itchy, twitchy, blood-sucking kind. So instead, smart households mixed in strong scented herbs like lavender, mint, wormwood, pennyroyal, and rosemary. Not for luxury, for defense. These herbs were nature's medieval bug spray. Their strong scents repelled fleas, lice, and mosquitoes, and occasionally your spouse. Some herbs, like tansy or rue, were even believed to keep demons away. Conveniently, they also kept away nosy in-laws. The result? A bed that smelled like a suspiciously pleasant salad kept the crawlies at bay for a few nights at least. After that, you had to refresh the herbs or risk being scratched awake by a tick with anger management issues. It didn't stop at mattresses either. Herbs were strewn across floors, woven into door frames, and hung in bunches over beds. Basically, if you could shove a sprig of wormwood into it, you did. It turned homes into slightly terrifying apothecaries, but cleaner, safer, and better smelling than a neighbor's goat barn. In an age before bug nets and DEET, this was brilliant. Entire manuals were written on which herbs worked best. Some people even believed that dreams were sweeter when you slept on lavender. Science. Questionable. But if it made you forget the damp ceiling and the fact your pillow was a sack of oats, then bless it. Long before the age of refrigerators humming in the kitchen and light-up freezer drawers filled with forgotten peas, medieval folks had to get creative to keep their food from turning into science experiments. Enter the marvel of passive preservation. Stone cooling shelves, also known as slab shelves, larders, or to put it simply, that cold rock we put the cheese on. Here's how it worked. Thick slabs of stone, often slate or marble if you were fancy, were built into the shaded walls of homes, particularly on the north-facing side where the sun rarely touched. These stone shells absorbed the naturally cooler temperatures of the earth and surrounding air, creating a sort of ambient cold zone, basically a medieval version of a mini fridge, but with less noise and more spiders. In cooler months, they kept milk, butter, meats, and whatever passed for leftovers from spoiling too quickly. Even in warmer weather, the stone remained cooler than the air thanks to its thermal mass, which is science speak for rock doesn't care how hot it is outside. No cords, no motors, no light bulb to shame you at 2 a.m. Just stone, shade, and sheer hope. Some homes even had entire stone pantries or cold rooms with thick walls and earthen floors. These were precursors to modern root cellars, and they were usually located as far away from the cooking fire as possible, because while medieval people loved hot soup, they didn't want it slowly heating their butter storage. In wealthier households, these shelves could be lined with damp cloths or porous jars filled with evaporating water to enhance the cooling effect. A clever use of physics without ever uttering the word evaporative. In poorer homes, it was just put the milk on the cold slab and hope it doesn't curdle before lunch. These days, if you twist an ankle or get stung by a bee, you reach for an ice pack, painkillers, or maybe a gel that promises cooling relief and delivers mild regret. But in the Middle Ages, when medicine often involved leeches or someone whispering Latin over a goat horn, people had a more accessible, less terrifying option. Cabbage leaves. Yes, cabbage. The humble vegetable known today for ruining school lunches and making boiled dishes smell like despair once played a starring role in medieval first aid. Cabbage leaf dressings were used for everything from swelling and bruises to mastitis, joint pain, and occasional plague-adjacent mystery rash. The logic? Simple. Cabbage's cooling flexible, and slightly antimicrobial. A natural compress that came pre-wrapped in its own leafy packaging. You'd take a large, preferably cold cabbage leaf, crush it slightly to release the juices, and then wrap it around the injured area, often securing it with linen or a bit of wishful thinking. The effect was surprisingly soothing. The leaves' cool moisture helped reduce inflammation, while the natural compounds, including sulfur, flavonoids, and enough farm smell to keep relatives at arm's length, did the rest. Some healers would warm the leaves instead, depending on the ailment, for chest congestion or sore joints. A heated cabbage poultice was the medieval equivalent of Vicks VapoRub, only leafier and less minty. And unlike many treatments of the era, it didn't involve bloodletting or chanting under the moon. It was simple, repeatable, and didn't require a trained monk or a full moon sacrifice, just a cabbage and a bit of patience. Of course, in lean times, those same leaves might end up in your soup pot once you're done using them, which adds a whole new level of appreciation for medieval resilience and stomachs made of iron. Before electricity, candles, or the smug glow of a solar-powered lantern, medieval people had to get creative about keeping the darkness at bay. And when torches were expensive and candles were for churches or the rich, everyday folks turned to something cheaper, smellier, and weirdly effective. Rushlights, also known as bacon torches, for the budget-conscious. So what exactly is a rushlight? Imagine a long, thin reed or rush plant commonly found in marshy areas. So basically everywhere you didn't want to walk barefoot. These rushes were dried, peeled, and then soaked in animal fat, usually bacon drippings, mutton tallow, or anything vaguely greasy and not immediately needed for dinner. The result? A slow-burning, semi-flammable wick that could be propped up in a metal clip and lit like a candle. The light wasn't exactly romantic. It sputtered, smoked, and had all the charm of a bacon-scented fire hazard. But it worked, and in the Middle Ages that was good enough. Each rushlight could burn anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how well it was soaked and how thick the rush was. If you needed more time, you lit another one. If you needed better light, you moved closer. And if your rushlight went out in a drafty room, well, welcome to the fun world of medieval darkness. Rushlights weren't just for lighting, though. They were timers, too. Need to boil something for half a rushlight's length? Done. Want to see how long it takes Gerald to return from the alehouse? Light one and count. They were cheap, fast to make, and surprisingly sustainable. Assuming you didn't mind your house smelling faintly like fried pig and marsh water. Today we store butter in refrigerators, plastic tubs, or inside artisanal wooden churns if you're really committed to pretending you live on a Victorian dairy farm. But in the Middle Ages, refrigeration wasn't an option. So naturally, someone looked at a swamp and thought, yeah, let's put the dairy product in there. And thus, bog butter was born. Bog butter is exactly what it sounds like. Butter, or sometimes lard, that was buried in a peat bog. Why a bog? Because despite being full of mud, insects, and things that probably hiss when disturbed, bogs are cold, oxygen-poor, and acidic. Nature's least inviting but surprisingly effective preservation chamber. People would take large quantities of butter, wrap them in cloth, bark, or even wooden barrels, and bury them deep in the peat and not for a few hours. We're talking months, years, or in some cases, centuries. Archaeologists in Ireland have found bog butter over 3,000 years old. That's right, some ancient Celtic peasant's forgotten snack is now in a museum instead of on toast. The cold, airless bog kept bacteria and fungi from spoiling the butter, and the tannins in the peat helped prevent oxidation. The result? A weirdly preserved lump of dairy that, according to brave modern taste testers, smells like cheese, smoke, and earthy regret. Now, was this the go-to for your everyday kitchen butter? No. This was long-term survival mode storage, likely used for winter rations, tribute, or that cousin who always came uninvited in spring asking for food. Burying your butter in a bog also had the benefit of security. Want to keep thieves away? Hide your valuables in a freezing, ankle-deep mud pit. No one's digging for breakfast in that. If you're imagining medieval people living in cozy hobbit holes with rustic larders and shelves of neatly labeled preserves, think again. Food storage was often less Pinterest and more Please don't let this go rancid before winter kills us all. And one of the cleverest solutions: hollow trees? Yes, the original pantry that grew itself required zero carpentry and came with built-in camouflage. Hollow trees were surprisingly common across the medieval countryside. Whether naturally formed from age, lightning, rot, or over enthusiastic squirrels, these cavities became impromptu storage units for peasants, travelers, and anyone with something perishable and no better options. Need to stash cheese, dried meat, or apples away from house? Shove it in a tree. Want to keep food from being stolen by the neighbor's goat? Or worse, the neighbor? Tree. Traveling through the woods and need a cold place to store that questionable pheasant you found in the tree. The interior of a hollow tree provided shade, insulation, and natural concealment. The thick bark and enclosed cavity kept temperatures relatively stable and helped slow spoilage. Not ideal for long-term preservation, but perfect for short-term storage, especially in cooler months. Some even lined the inside with leaves, moss, or bark to keep things dry and add a touch of that rustic medieval feng shui. Others placed food inside ceramic or leather containers before tucking them into the hollow, which at least gave the illusion that squirrels weren't licking your dinner. It wasn't just for food either. Hollow trees were also used to hide valuables, weapons, herbal remedies, and in a pinch, small children during raids. Not as a babysitting technique. A good tree could be the difference between starving and surviving, or at least the difference between cold cheese and suspiciously warm cheese. In the survival world, eating bark is usually code for things that have gone very wrong. But in the Middle Ages, it was actually a legit survival food. Introducing bark bread, a medieval delicacy that says, I didn't starve, but I did chew a pine tree. During times of famine, peasants often turned to the forest not for game or mushrooms. Too seasonal, too poisonous. But for tree bark, specifically the inner bark or cambium from pine, birch, or elm trees. This isn't the tough outer stuff. It's the soft, moist layer just beneath that was shaved off, dried, ground into flour, and mixed into bread dough. Was it delicious? No. Was it nutritious? Actually, surprisingly, yes. Bark contains fiber, trace minerals, and complex carbs. It kept people alive when grain stores were empty, taxes were due, and the cows had mysteriously stopped producing milk, probably unionizing. Most recipes mixed bark flour with whatever was available. Acorns, nettles, actual flour, if you were lucky, and baked it into flat, chewy loaves that looked like bread and tasted like forest. But when your choices were to bake bread or to grow your own, you chose carbs. Some people even toasted or roasted the bark before grinding it, which gave it a smoky flavor, or at least distracted from the fact that you were eating tree. And it wasn't just for peasants. During sieges and harsh winters, entire communities relied on bark-based food to survive, sometimes even taxing how much cambium you could harvest from communal forests. Too much bark collection. And the tree died. Not enough. And the villagers did. So if the world ends and you're standing in the woods, no food in sight, don't panic. Just look for a birch, channel your inner peasant, and remember you can totally eat that. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, beauty was a daily devotion. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't just groom themselves. They ritualized it. For them, cleanliness and adornment were signs of civility, favor with the gods, and even political status. You weren't just putting on a face for the world. You were preparing yourself for divine observation. Let's start with the eyes. Thick black eyeliner wasn't born in Cleopatra's boudoir. It was thriving centuries earlier in Sumer. Both men and women painted dramatic lines using kohl, a powder concoction of lead, copper, or an antimony. While this might horrify modern dermatologists, they believed it protected them from evil spirits and more practically from the desert sun's glare. Their skincare routine would make modern influences porous. Crushed semi-precious stones were mixed into oils to exfoliate and brighten the skin. Mud from the riverbanks full of minerals was smeared onto the body in thick cooling layers after it dried. It was gently scraped off, leaving the skin smooth and luminous. Yes, the first clay masks were less spa day and more ancient science. Hair removal was another ordeal. Using sharpened seashells or early tweezers, they plucked, scraped, or burned off body hair. Smoothness was equated with refinement and with godliness. The more polished your appearance, the closer you were to resembling divine perfection. Even their statues of gods and priestesses are hairless and immaculately styled, with symmetrical features and wide painted eyes. And let's not forget the scent. Fragrant oils weren't just pleasant, they were powerful. Myrrh, frankincense, and cedar were infused into animal fats and applied to the skin like perfumes. People believed these scents purified the body and pleased the gods. In royal courts, perfumed oils were so valuable that they were offered as tribute. Eyebrows tattooed. Permanent cosmetics weren't invented in the 20th century. They were already practiced in ancient temples. Women inked their brows using soot or natural dyes, creating bold arches that framed their faces dramatically. It was beautiful with commitment. If you think today's beauty trends are extreme, let's talk about Cleopatra. Yes, the queen of eyeliner was more than just a seductress. She was the poster girl for Greco-Roman beauty obsession. While her face graced coins, her influence reached into every apothecary and boudoir from Alexandria to Rome, and she wasn't alone. Roman women inherited Egypt's taste for luxury and then dialed it up to 11. Let's begin with the iconic milk bath. Cleopatra was rumored to bathe in donkey milk daily. Whether it was 500 donkeys or just a strong rumor, the truth is this. Lactic acid, found in sour milk, is a natural exfoliant. Romans copied this enthusiastically. Elite women bathed in milk, honey, and rose petals, believing it would smooth wrinkles and lighten the skin. And yes, it worked, just not for your wallet. Now to the face. Roman women desired pale, almost ghostly skin, a sign you were wealthy enough to avoid sunlight. Enter Cerussa, a face powder made of white lead, highly toxic. But hey, it gave that flawless matte finish. Women applied this daily, layering it on thick over the cheeks and forehead. Over time, it caused sores, hair loss, and in some cases death, but looking like a goddess. Worth it. Rouge and lip stain were made from red ochre, crushed beetles, or mulberry juice. The more vivid your lips and cheeks, the more youthful and seductive you appeared. For eyeliner and eyebrows, soot mixed with animal fat did the trick. And if your eyebrows weren't naturally bold, no problem, just draw them on. Or better yet, tattoo them, just like in Mesopotamia. Hair was another battlefield. Roman women curled their hair into intricate styles using heated metal rods, long before your grandmother's curling iron. They dyed it using herbs, ash, or even fermented leeches. Yes, seriously, for that fashionable blonde look. Wigs made from German slave hair were common among elite Roman women trying to show off their wealth and style. And perfume? An empire in itself. Romans were addicted to scent. Oils infused with saffron, cinnamon, and roses were rubbed into every crease of the body. Bathhouses smelled like botanical gardens dipped in musk. In ancient China, beauty wasn't flashy. It was philosophical. Where Rome chased glamour, the Chinese aesthetic prized balance, harmony, and inner key. But don't mistake subtlety for simplicity. The beauty rituals of dynastic China were just as rigorous, deeply spiritual, and sometimes shockingly intense. Start with the skin. Chinese beauty standards revered a pale, porcelain-like complexion, not because they fear the sun, but because fair skin symbolized nobility and leisure. Peasant women worked the fields under harsh sunlight. Aristocratic women. They stayed indoors and preserved their complexions like priceless scrolls, white lead powder, ground pearls, and even powdered rice were common ingredients. It wasn't just makeup, it was medicine too. Many formulas were designed by court physicians and believed to boost qi or prolong life. But the real star of ancient Chinese skincare was jade. Jade rollers, which TikTok made trendy again, were used centuries ago by Han Dynasty women. Cool to the touch and symbolically connected to immortality, jade tools were rolled across the face to promote circulation, reduce puffiness, and maintain youth. Even emperors were known to keep jade pillows, believing the stone would draw toxins from the skin while they slept. Eyebrows were serious business. Women shaped and painted their brows to reflect fashion and politics. In some dynasties, long, swooping brows were in vogue in others. Short and upward tilted lines dominated. Ink made from burnt willow or charcoal was applied with brushes made from rabbit fur. Some trends even encouraged removing natural brows altogether and redrawing them higher on the forehead, achieving a more heavenly appearance. Lips were tinted with a blend of cinnabar and animal fat, sometimes mixed with beeswax. Rouge, made from safflower petals, was dabbed on cheeks in small circles and beauty marks. They weren't accidental. Some women painted tiny black dots near their lips or eyes, considered flirtatious symbols of charm and mystique. Hair care was a daily ritual. Women used fermented rice water and camellia oil to wash and nourish their hair, which they often grew down to their knees. Elaborate updos held in place with jade pins and golden combs weren't just about style. They were a declaration of status, elegance, and cultural refinement. To the ancient Chinese, beauty wasn't loud or lethal. It was meditative, disciplined, and symbolic. It was artful restraint paired with quiet power, written not in words, but in the soft glow of powdered faces and the curve of the perfect brow. If ever there was a time when beauty killed, literally, it was the Renaissance in the courts of Italy, England, and France. Women weren't just enhancing their appearance, they were slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of perfection. The goal? A glowing alabaster white face with blood-red lips and high, delicate brows. The method? A chemical cocktail that would terrify a modern dermatologist. Let's start with the most infamous Venetian ceruse. This was a luxurious face paste made from white lead and vinegar. It gave a smooth, bone-white finish, hiding blemishes and wrinkles. Queen Elizabeth I wore it religiously. Under candlelight, it gave a luminous glow that made skin look porcelain. But the downside? Skin corrosion, paralysis, tooth decay, and eventually death. It was the Renaissance equivalent of a slow-drip time bomb. But wait, there's arsenic too. For women who wanted to brighten their complexion or lighten freckles, arsenic wafers were sold as miracle pills. Swallowing small doses supposedly gave the skin a translucent look. It also caused vomiting, kidney damage, and internal bleeding. But beauty waits for no one, not even your liver. Eyebrows were plucked into thin arches or removed entirely. A high rounded forehead was fashionable, so women sometimes shaved their hairlines an inch or two to create the illusion of a larger brain, and therefore higher virtue. Balding was rebranded as high status. Cheek color came from crushed berries, cochineal bugs, or vermilion. Lips were painted with similar mixes. Some women used mercury-based red dyes, which added a seductive pop of color and irreversible nerve damage. Flushed cheeks were not just pretty, they indicated youth and vitality, something aristocrats cherished in an era of short lifespans. And the smell. Point. Fragrances made from ambergris, musk, and civet were worn not just for allure, but to mask the unwashed reality beneath layers of toxic cosmetics. After all, bathing was still viewed with suspicion in many parts of Europe. There, golden locks were ideal, especially in Italy. Women bleached their hair using mixtures of sulfur, soda, and lemon juice. Then sat in the sun, wearing wide-brimmed hats with the tops cut out to expose only their hair. It worked, but also fried their scalps. Long before modern skincare touted natural as a buzzword, ancient India had already written the manual. And it wasn't just skin care. It was Ayurveda, the science of life. Indian beauty rituals weren't isolated routines. They were extensions of spiritual wellness, diet, and inner balance. Beauty was the outer mirror of your dashas, your elemental energies. Let's start with the bath. The ritual of cleansing was sacred. Women of the Vedic period bathed in turmeric-infused water or milk, followed by exfoliation with Upton, a paste of chickpea flour, sandalwood, turmeric, milk, and rose water. It brightened the skin, slowed aging, and purified energy. No parabens, no microplastics. Just ingredients from the kitchen that doubled as sacred medicine. Hair was a crowning glory. Coconut oil, amla, Indian gooseberry, and hibiscus were infused into warm oils, massaged into the scalp to stimulate growth, calm the mind, and ward off premature graying. Thick waist-length hair wasn't just an aesthetic. It was a marker of vitality and femininity. Hair oiling sessions were communal, intimate, and meditative. Kajol, the black eyeliner still used across India today, had spiritual roots. Made from soot and ghee, it was believed to protect from the evil eye. Mothers would apply it not just to themselves, but to their babies as a shield against negative forces. But it also framed the eyes beautifully, giving them the depth of ancient poetry fragrance. Entire cities like Kannauj became famous for distilling adders, perfumes made from flowers like jasmine, rose, and vetiver. These oils were rubbed onto the skin, used in hair, and even mixed into bath water. Their purpose wasn't just seduction, but spiritual clarity. Scents helped align the senses with the divine. Lip and cheek tints came from beetroot, saffron, and crushed rose petals. And teeth cleaned with neem sticks and charcoal long before plastic toothbrushes arrived. Even dental hygiene was a ritual, timed with moon cycles and linked to dashic balance. Perhaps most unique was mehendi, henna. Used to decorate hands and feet, especially during weddings, henna wasn't just cosmetic. It cooled the body, lowered stress, and signified joy, fertility, and transformation. Every swirl in the design told a story. The ancient Greeks adored beauty, but not in the flashy, gilded sense of later empires. For them, beauty was moral. Physical perfection reflected a virtuous soul. A sculpted body or symmetrical face wasn't just attractive. It was a sign of inner harmony, intelligence, and divine favor. So it's no surprise that grooming in classical Greece was practically a civic duty. Let's begin with the skin. Like the Romans, Greeks idolized pale complexions. A white face meant leisure and nobility. A tan face meant you worked outside, which was for slaves and peasants. To achieve this ghostly ideal, Greek women used powders made from white lead, again chalk or crushed seashells. These powders weren't subtle. In fact, some women layered them so thickly that they cracked when they smiled. But hey, beauty is sacrifice. Red lips and cheeks came from mulberries, red iron oxide, or even wine dregs. The richer the red, the more desirable the look. However, the application had to be light. Heavy makeup was frowned upon. A modest flush meant good health and chastity. Too much was associated with prostitutes known as hetaira, who famously used richer rouge and elaborate cosmetics. To entertain philosophers and statesmen alike, hair care was no afterthought. Greek women prized long, wavy hair, often styled in braids, buns or knots, and held together with ivory or bronze pins. To lighten their hair, they rubbed in vinegar, lemon juice, and sometimes used ashes. Blonde hair, especially, was idealized as divine and foreign. Think Helen of Troy. Wigs and hairpieces made from enslaved northern women weren't uncommon among the elite. Eyebrows were key. A single continuous brow. Yes, a unibrow was a sign of purity and intelligence. Women who weren't naturally blessed would fake it using powdered antimony or soot. Some even glued goat hair between their brows, all for that soft, scholarly look. Perfumes were blended with care. Using olive oil as a base mixed with herbs like marjoram, thyme, and iris root, they were applied after bathing, which the Greeks did obsessively, often in public baths. Cleanliness was next to godliness, literally. In the jungles and highlands of Mesoamerica, beauty wasn't soft, and it definitely wasn't subtle. For the Aztec and Mayan civilizations, beauty was bold, a physical badge of identity, power, and sacred duty. The ideal body was crafted, carved, and sometimes painfully altered, all in service of the gods and societal status. Let's start with the most intense cranial modification. Among both the Mayans and Aztecs, shaping a baby's skull was seen as an enhancement. From infancy, wooden boards were gently but firmly bound to a child's head to elongate the skull into a sloped, almost cone-like shape. It was a sign of nobility, intelligence, and beauty. The longer and smoother the forehead, the higher your social standing. Next up, dental decoration. Forget whitening strips. Mayan elites embedded jade, turquoise, and even hematite into their teeth. Tiny holes were drilled with obsidian tools, and precious stones were glued in with natural resins. They sparkled when they smiled. Literal. The pain tolerance. Astronomical. Filed teeth were also fashionable, shaped into sharp points or symmetrical patterns to mimic animal traits, suggesting strength or divine connection. Skin and face painting played a major role in daily life and ritual. Aztec women often wore red and yellow pigments on their cheeks, while both men and women used black paint for ceremonies. The colors weren't random, they had meaning. Red was for life and fertility. Black often signified war or devotion. Some paints were made from crushed insects like cochineal, giving a vibrant crimson hue. Piercings and tattoos were spiritual commitments. Ear, nose, and lip piercings were common, often adorned with jade or bone jewelry. Tattoos created with thorns and ink displayed one's family lineage, religious role, or even battlefield honors. These weren't subtle accessories. They were declarations of loyalty to gods like Quetzalcoatl or Ixchel. Even crossed eyes were considered attractive among the Maya. Mothers dangled beads in front of their infants' noses, training them to look inward until their eyes misaligned. This wasn't seen as a defect, but as a sign of mystical insight. Across the vast and varied landscapes of ancient Africa, beauty was as diverse as the terrain itself, from the lush Nile Valley to the savannas of Nubia, and the trade cities of West Africa. Beauty rituals were both practical and profoundly symbolic. Adornment wasn't just a matter of style, it was a statement of identity, status, and even cosmic alignment. Let's begin in ancient Egypt, where beauty was practically a science. Both men and women wore kohl around their eyes, not just for allure, but as protection. The black pigment is made from galena or lead sulfide, reduced sun glare and warded off infections. The dramatic lines extended beyond the lids, creating the famous almond-eyed look of Egyptian art. Eyes weren't just mirrors of the soul, they were sacred instruments, channels to the divine. Perfume was a luxury and a necessity. Egyptians loved scent so much that they created perfume cones, wax cones infused with myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus oil that were worn on the head during ceremonies. As the cone melted in the heat, it released fragrance coating the hair and body. Daily hygiene included scented oils after bathing, often applied with stone or alabaster jars that were art pieces in themselves. Skincare was rooted in both beauty and climate survival. Palm oil, shea butter, and castor oil were used to protect the skin from harsh sun and dryness. These oils weren't just moisturizing, they were medicinal mixed with herbs. They healed wounds, soothed rashes, and preserved the skin's glow. Body scrubs were made from sand or crushed seeds, keeping skin exfoliated and clean long before loofahs were invented. In Nubia, hairstyles were central to identity. Elaborate braids and shave patterns told stories of tribe, age, and marital status. Hair was often dyed with henna or decorated with beads, shells, and gold threads. The towering styled coif was more than fashionable. It was regal. Further in ancient Yoruba or Songhai territories, body painting using indigo and ochre pigments played a role in rituals and celebrations. Tribal markings, either scarified or painted, were not seen as blemishes, but beauty enhancements and markers of strength and heritage. Beauty has always demanded something in return. Time, effort, money. But in the ancient world, it could also demand your health, your sanity, and even your life. Across civilizations, the pursuit of perfection often crossed into dangerous territory. While these rituals were admired and even worshipped, they sometimes left scars far deeper than the cosmetic. We've already seen the chilling ingredients: lead, arsenic, mercury, and crushed insects, all used in makeup and skincare. What these substances had in common was toxicity. Lead face powders used in Rome, Greece, and later Renaissance Europe caused hair loss, muscle paralysis, and slow organ failure. And yet, the paler your skin, the higher your desirability. It was a poison wrapped in a compliment. In ancient China, women of the elite class once bound their feet from an early age in pursuit of the so-called lotus foot, an ideal that symbolized grace and obedience. Though foot binding became more dominant during later dynasties, early iterations of similar practices already existed. The result was permanent deformity. But it wasn't considered cruelty, it was considered beauty. Let's not forget the ritualized pain of tattoos, piercings, and body modifications. For the Maya and Aztecs, inserting jade into your teeth or reshaping your skull was seen as a mark of honor. But the risk of infection, pain, and permanent damage was high. Likewise, in ancient African and Middle Eastern cultures, scarification was a sign of strength and beauty, but involved cutting intricate patterns into the skin, often without antiseptics. Even perfumes could be dangerous. In Egypt, perfume cones often included ingredients like cinnamon oil, which in high concentrations can burn the skin. And since bathing with water was a luxury, heavy oils could trap dirt and bacteria, leading to infections. Cosmetics and treatments weren't regulated or standardized. One person's beauty secret was another's slow demise. And since many rituals were passed down by word of mouth or inscribed in secretive texts, misinformation was as common as vanity itself. In every culture, the pursuit of beauty reflected the values of time, power, divinity, nobility, and virtue. But the cost? It was often paid in silence. The scars were hidden beneath powders, perfumes, and elaborate hairstyles. Long before Monopoly ruined family dinners, the people of ancient Mesopotamia were already obsessed with board games, especially one called the Royal Game of UR. Discovered in the 1920s by British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the Royal Cemetery of UR, this game dates back over 4,500 years. But it wasn't just some idle diversion tucked away in a dusty corner. It was sacred, symbolic, possibly even cosmic. The game's board itself is a masterpiece, a small rectangular box with 20 decorated squares made of lapis lazuli, shell, and red limestone inlaid in bitumen. Imagine something that looked less like a toy and more like a divine artifact. Players moved their pieces using tetrahedral dice. Four-sided pyramid shapes race from one end of the board to the other. The goal? Get all 7 of your pieces off the board before your opponent. Sounds simple enough, but the deeper you look, the more layered it becomes. Some scholars believe the layout represents a spiritual journey, a metaphor for the soul's progress through fate and chaos. The middle squares were thought to be dangerous or magical places of chance, protection, or divine judgment. In this view, winning wasn't just about luck. It was about navigating the cosmos wisely, like threading a needle through the will of the gods. And speaking of gods, yes, they were involved. Clay tablets from later periods describe how people used the game for divination. Scribes would consult dice throws and interpret them as omens, using the game as a sort of oracle. Think of it as ancient tarot by way of competitive backgammon. The Royal Game of UR wasn't just played in temples or palaces. Versions of it have been found as far away as India and Egypt, suggesting it spread along trade routes and captivated multiple cultures. It may have been the first truly international board game long before chess or checkers were even invented. For the ancient Sumerians, playing the Royal Game of UR wasn't merely about killing time, it was about confronting fate, testing divine favor, and perhaps glimpsing the hidden structure of the universe. It was a game, yes, but also a ritual, a race, and a rehearsal for eternity. Senet wasn't just a board game, it was a passport to the afterlife. Played as early as 3100 BCE, Senet appears in tomb paintings, funerary texts, and even on the laps of pharaohs like Tutankhamun to the ancient Egyptians. Senet wasn't merely for entertainment. It was a ritual simulation of the soul's journey through the underworld, where every move on the board could echo through eternity. The Senet board consisted of 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. Each player had 5 or 7 pieces, and the object was to move them across the board and safely off the final square. The twist movement was determined by casting sticks or bones, which acted as rudimentary dice. But luck alone wouldn't win you the game. Strategy and timing were essential. What began as a casual pastime soon gained spiritual weight. By the New Kingdom period, around 1550 BCE, Senet had evolved into something far more than a household diversion. It was now a symbolic enactment of the soul's voyage through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Certain squares on the board came to represent key stages of that journey: rebirth, judgment, peril, purification. Each turn of the game wasn't just a gamble, it was an invocation of divine will. The iconography around Senet became increasingly mystical. Some boards were inscribed with hieroglyphs representing protective deities or spells. Square 26, for example, often symbolized the House of Rebirth, while Square 27 might be the House of Happiness. Landing there could mean divine protection, while other squares spelled delay or even danger. The board became a microcosm of the afterlife, a spiritual obstacle course laid out in cedar and paint. Senet was also closely tied to the goddess Maat, the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Playing Senet well was a symbolic rehearsal for navigating the trials of the afterlife, where the soul will be weighed against the feather of Maat. Win the game, and you might win immortality. Lose, let's just say you'd better hope someone packed extra amulets in your tomb. So while Senet may look like an ancient version of backgammon, It was much more part game, part theology, part guidebook to the netherworld. In Egypt, you didn't just play Senet, you prayed through it. To the untrained eye, knuckle bones looked like child's play, just a handful of oddly shaped bones tossed in the air. But in ancient Greece, it was far more than a simple pastime. It was a game of skill, chance, flirtation, and even divine symbolism. Whether in bustling Athenian marketplaces or quiet temple courtyards, knucklebones clattered across stone floors, echoing laughter, rivalry, and ritual. The game was originally played using the small ankle bones of sheep or goats, known as astragaloi. Unlike modern dice, these four-sided bones didn't roll in uniform patterns, making each throw unpredictable. Players tossed them into the air and tried to catch them on the back of their hand or land them in certain positions to score points. The rules varied by region and era, but the thrill was universal. It wasn't just kids who played, adults, particularly women, adored it. Greek vases and sculptures often show young girls playing knuckle bones in elegant robes, their faces full of concentration. For many, it was a game of elegance and dexterity, a kind of ancient fidget spinner meets social ritual. In fact, it was sometimes used as a courtship display, where a graceful throw might catch the eye of a passing suitor. But there was also something deeper. The astragaloi were often linked to fate and the gods. Each side of the bone had a name and a numerical value, which made them ideal for both gaming and divination. A good throw might be interpreted as a sign from the gods, perhaps even a message from Apollo or Hermes. And if you threw four the same side, that was the coveted Venus throw, a wind so perfect it was said to be touched by divine favor. The game also had strong ties to death and the afterlife. Knuckle bones were often placed in graves as toys or tools for divination in the next world. Some believed spirits could play through them, or that they helped the dead predict the future. Eventually, the game evolved. Greeks began casting knuckle bones made of bronze, glass, and ivory, but the core appeal remained. It was easy to learn, hard to master, and steeped in mystique. In Greece, knuckle bones were more than a game. They were flirting, fate, and fun, all rolled into a single toss. If chess is war on a board, then Ludus Latrunculorum was Rome's declaration of battle. This ancient Roman game, often shortened to Latrunculi or the game of little soldiers, wasn't just a way to pass time in a villa courtyard. It was an intellectual sparring match, a brainy rehearsal for real-world conflict. To play it well was to think like a general. The exact rules of Ludus Latrunculorum have been lost to time, but enough fragments, wooden boards, clay pieces, and literary references remain to paint a compelling picture. Played on a grid, often 8/8 or 9/10 squares, each player controlled an army of small uniform pieces called latrones or mercenaries. The objective? Outmaneuver your opponent and capture their pieces by surrounding them. No dice, no luck. Just cunning. What made it thrilling was its subtlety. This wasn't a race game like UR or Senet. It was tactical, demanding foresight and psychological warfare. Players would bait, feint, and trap, just like in actual military campaigns. Roman authors like Varro and Ovid mentioned it as a pastime favored by both soldiers and statesmen. Some saw it as a test of character. Others just liked humiliating their friends in front of a crowd, interestingly. The game wasn't confined to the elite. Latrunculi boards have been found scratched into stones, floors, and even rooftops across the Roman Empire, from Britain to Egypt. Soldiers played it while stationed on the frontier. Merchants played it between negotiations. It transcended class and culture, offering both escape and strategic training. The pieces themselves varied. Simple pebbles, carved ivory tokens, or glass counters. Some boards featured special squares, possibly fortresses or thrones, where key captures could occur. Scholars debate whether a single king piece existed in some versions, but regardless, the game rewarded ruthless logic over brute strength. Roman poets often used the game as a metaphor. Losing a piece was like losing favor in court, getting surrounded like political betrayal. Even the gods were said to play versions of it, suggesting that strategy was not just human, but divine. Ludus Latrunculorum may be extinct, but its spirit survives in modern games like chess and checkers. It was Rome's intellectual blood sport, a game where victory meant more than bragging rights. It meant superiority of mind. Before Senet reigned supreme in ancient Egypt, there was Mahan, a mysterious spiral-shaped board game named after a protective serpent god. Mahan wasn't just a game, it was a riddle wrapped in mythology, strategy, and ceremony. While the exact rules have vanished into the sands of time, the surviving boards and game pieces suggest that Mahan was more than just recreation. It was cosmic symbolism in motion. The board itself was striking, a coiled serpent. Its body segmented into rectangular spaces, spiraling inward toward the head. The Serpent Man was believed to protect the sun god Are during his nightly journey through the underworld. So in essence, each game was a reenactment of a divine voyage, players navigating the coils of danger, transformation, and rebirth. The pieces discovered alongside Mayan boards include small lion-shaped tokens and round marbles, or spheres. Scholars believe each player controlled a set of marbles that traveled through the serpent's body, possibly escorted or threatened by the lion figures. The lions may have acted as guardians, obstacles, or even competitive attackers. While it's unclear exactly how movement worked, it likely involved dice or casting sticks, as with other Egyptian games. What makes Mahan so fascinating is its rapid disappearance. Popular during the Old Kingdom around 2600 to 2300 BCE, it abruptly vanished from records and archaeological finds by the Middle Kingdom. Why? No one knows. Some theorize that its religious associations fell out of favor. Others believe it was simply overshadowed by the Senate's growing role in funerary rites. Either way, Mahan became a relic, leaving behind only beautiful serpent-shaped boards and silent, lion-headed pieces. Its presence outside Egypt is equally intriguing. Similar spiral boards have been found in Cyprus and the Levant, suggesting the game, or at least its imagery, traveled through trade or conquest. Did it retain its symbolic meaning in foreign lands, or was it stripped of myth and reduced to a puzzle? The evidence doesn't say, but the mystery only adds to Mahan's allure. In the end, Mahan was more than a pastime. It walked along the divine spine of it. Serpent, a metaphor for protection, risk, and the eternal cycle of life and death. To play, it was to enter a spiral, one where each move echoed with myth. Long before the Vikings wrote sagas or carved runestones, they played Tafel, a family of asymmetric board games that mirrored their brutal world of raids, sieges, and survival, from frozen longhouses in Norway to trading ports in Ireland. Tafel games were spread across the Norse world, sharpening minds as much as swords. These were not gentle pastimes. Tafel was warfare, distilled into strategy, deception, and calculated risk. The most famous version is Hennefehtafel, or King's Table, played on a square grid that varied in size, most commonly Elevens 11 or Thurkany 13. The asymmetry is the game's signature. One player commands a king and a small group of defenders in the center of the board. The other controls a larger army of attackers on the edges. The king's goal: escape to a corner square. The attacker's goal: capture the king by surrounding him on all four sides. There are no dice, no luck, only logic, planning, and brute positional play. And just like in Viking raids, the odds are not even. The attackers outnumber the defenders 2-1, forcing the king's player to think like a desperate leader, constantly evading, redirecting, and outwitting the enemy. Raffle boards were often carved from wood, antler, or even stone, with intricate grid patterns and stylized playing pieces. Wealthier warriors might own versions made of glass or bone, with figures shaped like warriors, kings, or dragons. The boards were portable, easy to carry on long ships, and the rules, though regional, shared the same heartbeat: conflict. It wasn't just entertainment. TFL trained Viking minds for real-world leadership and ambush tactics. It taught when to retreat, when to sacrifice, and how to think several moves ahead. In an age where alliances shifted like wind on the fjords, the ability to anticipate your opponent could mean the difference between glory and death. Tafel was so embedded in Norse culture that even Christian missionaries used it to connect with pagans, sometimes replacing the king piece with a bishop. But as chess spread into Scandinavia during the medieval period, Tafel began to fade, seen as a relic of the old gods. By the 12th century, it was nearly extinct, though echoes of it still survive in regional games like Tablet. In its prime, however, Tafel was more than a board game. It was a Viking battlefield, just quieter, cleaner, and played with bone instead of blood. In the grand courts of ancient India, amid elephants, incense, and sacred chants, the game was being played not just for fun, but for faith. Pachisi, known as the national game of India, was more than just a pastime. It was a cosmic dance of karma, kingship, and calculated risk. With origins dating back to at least the 6th century CE and possibly earlier, Pachisi was a favorite of emperors, especially the legendary Akbar the Great, who didn't just play it, he lived it. The game board is shaped like a giant cross, symbolizing the 4 cardinal directions and the intersection of fate. Each arm of the cross forms a path of squares converging at a central square, representing the throne or home. Players race their 4 pieces around the board, trying to return them all to the center before their opponents. The twist movement is determined by throwing 6 or 7 cowrie shells, not dice. The number of shells landing open side up dictates the movement, so every turn blends chance, choice, and divine whim. But Pachisi isn't just about movement, it's about capture. Land on an opponent's piece, and you send them back to the beginning. Timing, positioning, and bluffing are everything. A rash move can lead to disaster. A patient strategy can dominate the board. It's a game of nerves, much like the chess of war or the politics of court life. And yes, it was played in real life. Literally. Akbar famously built a massive courtyard version of the board at Fate per Sikri, where real people dressed in color-coded clothing acted as game pieces. He played from above, moving human tokens with royal authority. It was spectacle, statecraft, and spiritual theater all rolled into one. Pachisi's symbolic layers run deep. The cross-shaped board reflects the intersection of dharma, duty, artha, prosperity, karma, desire, and moksha, liberation. Success requires not just skill, but alignment with universal order. A good game, like a good life, balances risk and restraint. Later, British colonists adapted Pachisi into Ludo, flattening its symbolism into something more digestible. But the original game remains a masterpiece of ancient Indian thought. Pachisi was more than a race. It was a lesson in destiny, patience, and the subtle dance of karma across a board, where every throw mattered. If you were an Aztec, rolling the bones wasn't just a gamble, it was a spiritual transaction. Padole, one of Mesoamerica's oldest known games, was part gambling, part ritual, and part cosmic drama. It was played everywhere, from humble village corners to the great temples of Tenochtitlan, and always under the watchful eye of the gods, especially Macuilzicatl, the patron of games, dance, and excess. The game board was simple in appearance, a cross-shaped grid typically drawn on mats, stone, or even carved directly into temple steps. It contained 52 spaces, mirroring the Aztec calendar cycle of 52 years. This wasn't accidental. Time, fate, and cosmic cycles were embedded in every square. Players began with 6 beans marked with dots, functioning like primitive dice. These were thrown to determine how many spaces a player's token could move. Each player had a set of markers, often stones, bones, or carved figurines, that they maneuvered around a board in an effort to complete a circuit before their opponent. But Patoli wasn't just a race, it was a duel. Land on an opponent's piece and you could send it back to the start, or worse, eliminate it completely. But danger worked both ways. Certain squares were penalty spaces, tied to bad omens where landing meant forfeiting progress or goods. That's right, goods. Because Batali wasn't just play for pride, it was a full-blown gambling event. Players bet everything from food and blankets to gold dust, jade, and even slaves. High-stakes games could get intense. Spectators would gather, cheering or jeering, and priests sometimes oversaw matches to ensure fairness and spiritual propriety. Players made offerings to Macuilzicatl before major games, asking for luck or forgiveness in case of loss. To play Pali was to risk not only wealth, but divine disfavor. The Spanish, upon arriving, were horrified. They saw Pitali as a gateway to vice and paganism. Gambling was outlawed and boards destroyed, but the game lingered in memory, passed on secretly or morphed into less dangerous variants. What made Potterly unique wasn't just its mechanics, but its fusion of luck, strategy, and cosmology. The board was a miniature universe. Each throw was a spin of fate, and every game mirrored the eternal gamble between order and chaos, life and loss. To modernize, games are usually seen as leisure, something to unwind, compete, or kill time. But in the ancient world, games were often sacred. They weren't just entertainment. They were mirrors of the cosmos, training grounds for rulers and rehearsals for death, fate, and rebirth. Across civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, play was never just play. It was a ritual in disguise. Take the Senet and Padole, for instance. These weren't casual pastimes. They were embedded with religious meaning, often played in temples, tombs, and ceremonial contexts. Senet boards were found in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, not as toys, but as tools to guide the soul through the Duat, the underworld. Winning a Senet game wasn't about outsmarting your opponent. It was about proving your spiritual readiness for the afterlife. Likewise, in the Aztec world, Patali was played under divine surveillance. Macuilxochitl, the god of games and excess, demanded offerings and observance. The throws of beans weren't just lucky or unlucky. They were messages from the gods, signs of favor or punishment. Losing your possessions could be seen as karmic justice. Winning a momentary alignment with cosmic forces. Even more abstract games like Mayan and Pachisi carried rich symbolic weight. Mayan reenacted the serpent god coiled around the sun god Are during his nightly journey through the underworld. Every movement on the board symbolized protection, progress, or peril. Pachasi, with its cross-shaped layout, wasn't just about reaching the center. It was a model of dharma, karma, and moksha, the entire spiritual cycle rendered in cowrie shells and tokens. And the role of games in education and warcraft can't be overstated. Games like Ludus Latrunculorum and Tafel weren't just distractions for soldiers. They were tactical simulations. Emperors, generals, and young nobles played them not just to win, but to learn. Games trained a mind to anticipate moves, counter threats, and balance aggression with strategy. They forged leaders in silence, away from the battlefield. So whether they were rolled in temples, chanted in courts, or carved into stone, ancient games served multiple roles. They were amused, yes, but they also taught, healed, judged, and prepared. They connected humans to the divine, players to fate, and time to eternity. In the ancient world, when you sat down to play, you weren't escaping life. You were living it deeper. Mary Wollstonecraft. Godwin entered the world on August 30th, 1797, with more pressure in her first breath than most feel in a lifetime. She was born into an intellectual earthquake. Her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, were two of the most radical thinkers of their time. Her mother was the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a fiery feminist treatise that dared to argue women were rational beings worthy of education and equality. Her father was a political philosopher and novelist who rejected monarchy, organized religion, and traditional marriage. Together, they formed one of the most revolutionary unions in Enlightenment England. And then, 11 days after Mary's birth, her mother died. From the beginning, Mary's life was marked by brilliance and loss, raised by her father in a house filled with books, ideas, and visiting radicals. She grew up surrounded by the ghost of a mother she never knew, but whose voice rang through the pages of her writing. Her father did not hide these works. He encouraged Mary to read them. Her education was anything but ordinary. She absorbed Greek myths, science, poetry, philosophy, and history before most children had learned to write a paragraph. The garden became her classroom. Her thoughts were fed by the likes of Coleridge, Rousseau, and Voltaire. But the household was far from idyllic. William Godwin eventually remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary Jane Clairmont, was cold and contentious. The new Mrs. Godwin favored her own children and viewed Mary as a moody, defiant girl with too much imagination. Mary, for her part, despised the domestic expectations placed on her and found solace only in writing and dreaming. By age 10, she was scribbling her own stories. By 14, she was reading books most adults would fear to touch. She was not a girl built for embroidery and tea. She was a storm, quietly gathering strength. Mary's childhood, framed by the ideals of political revolution, personal freedom, and feminist rebellion, laid the foundation for a life unlike any other. Her origins were haunted by death, defined by genius, and forged in fire. She was not simply her parents' daughter. She was already becoming something stranger and far more powerful. Mary Shelley, the future mother of science fiction. In the summer of 1814, Mary Godwin, just 16 years old, did something that would ignite scandal across literary London. She ran away, but not alone. She eloped with the already married, wildly idealistic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, a man 5 years her senior, who was both her father's admirer and his greatest disappointment. What began as a romantic rebellion would soon unravel into grief, exile, and artistic fire. Mary met Percy in her father's home, where the poet often visited to debate philosophy and pay homage to Godwin's writings. But it was Mary, not her father, who enchanted him. Quiet yet intense, she shared Percy's fascination with liberty, science, and the supernatural. They read together by her mother's grave in St. Pancras churchyard, where she would often retreat to be near the woman she'd never known. It was there, between headstones and candle-lit books, that their love story began. Their departure was abrupt and reckless. Mary Percy and Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, left England and sailed across the Channel to France with barely a change of clothes and no clear plan. Percy abandoned his pregnant wife Harriet, a decision that would haunt all of them. The trio wandered through revolutionary France and Switzerland on foot, writing in their journals by day and sleeping in flea-bitten inns by night. Their money ran out quickly, forcing them back to England in disgrace. What followed was a spiral of hardship. Percy's creditors hounded them. Mary's father, once the voice of free love, shunned her, and the children began to die. Mary gave birth to a daughter who died within weeks. "Dream that my little baby came to life again," she wrote in her journal. Awake and find no baby. Grief had entered her bloodstream, and it never left. Yet through the turbulence, Mary's mind sharpened. She was reading voraciously. Greek myths, alchemy, Galvanism, scientific theories about reanimation. She was living in exile, a radical woman in a conservative world. Her relationship with Percy was both intoxicating and exhausting. He was brilliant, erratic, emotionally distant, yet passionately supportive of her writing. Mary Shelley had become an outcast, but she was no victim. Her life, already overflowing with rebellion and heartbreak, was laying the groundwork for something extraordinary. And in just a few short years, on the shores of Lake Geneva, lightning would strike. In the summer of 1816, Mary Godwin, now Mary Shelley, found herself at the heart of one of literary history's most infamous vacations. She was in Switzerland, staying at the Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva with her lover Percy Shelley, her stepsister Claire Claremont, the notorious Lord Byron, and Byron's physician, John Polidori. The weather was miserable. Thanks to the eruption of Mount Tambora the year before, the skies were choked with ash. Crops failed. Temperatures dropped. It became known as the year without a summer. Trapped indoors, the group passed the time, telling ghost stories and discussing science, poetry, and philosophy. One night, Byron proposed a challenge. Each person should write their own supernatural tale. A creative storm began to brew, one that would change literature forever. Mary was just 18. Byron and Shelley were already celebrated poets. Polidori would go on to write The Vampire, the precursor to Dracula. But it was Mary, quiet and observant, who would shatter expectations. At first, she struggled to come up with an idea. Days passed then. During a conversation about galvanism, the use of electricity to reanimate dead tissue, something clicked. That night, Mary had a vision. In her words, "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out." She had dreamed of a scientist and the monster he brought to life. Thus was born Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The novel wasn't just horror. It was a fusion of science, myth, and grief. Victor Frankenstein's obsession with creating life mirrored the age's fascination with scientific progress. The creature, shunned and unloved, reflected Mary's own feelings of abandonment and otherness. Themes of parenthood, isolation, and guilt bled onto every page, drawn from her losses and the chaotic men around her. When Frankenstein was published in 1818, it was anonymous. Many assumed Percy had written it. He had penned the preface. He was the husband. He was the man. But the truth couldn't stay hidden. The world would come to know Mary Shelley not only as the wife of a poet, but as the mother of science fiction. In one summer, she had taken lightning, death, and her own sorrow, and made a monster that would never die after the birth of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's life didn't settle into literary triumph. Instead, it plunged deeper into sorrow. Death had always circled her, but in years following 1818, it closed in relentlessly. Even as her creation began to walk in the public imagination, her own family began to vanish. Mary and Percy returned to England, where grief struck again. Their two young children, Clara and William, both died. Clara from dysentery in Italy. William died from malaria shortly after Mary was devastated. She had now lost 3 children in as many years. The pain was bottomless, she wrote. I am not now in a state to be comforted. She isolated herself, her mind darkened by nightmares, and her health began to deteriorate. Yet amidst the sorrow, a glimmer of life emerged. In 1819, she gave birth to her only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. He would become her anchor in the years to come, but even he could not shield her from the next blow. In 1822, tragedy struck again, this time brutally and suddenly. Percy Shelley drowned in a storm while sailing off the coast of Italy. His body washed ashore, unrecognizable except for a volume of Keats's poetry in his pocket. Mary was just 24 years old, widowed. Broke and emotionally shattered, she had lived through the deaths of 3 children, her half-sister Fanny's suicide, the suicide of Percy's estranged wife Harriet, and now the drowning of the love of her life. It was a gothic horror non-fiction could rival. Yet somehow she endured. Mary gathered Percy's remains, both literal and literary. She preserved his poems, his reputation, and even allegedly kept a piece of his calcified heart wrapped in silk, stored in her writing desk. Grief was no longer just a companion. It was her constant muse, and through it all she kept writing. Her pen became her lifeline. She composed Valperga, a historical novel, The Last Man, a post-apocalyptic vision of plague and isolation that eerily mirrored her own desolation. And she edited and published Percy's works, ensuring his legacy wouldn't drown with him. Mary Shelley didn't just survive tragedy. She absorbed it, transformed it, and turned it into art. Love had defined her early years, but now lost would shape her myth by the mid-1820s. Mary Shelley was alone in a way few young women of her era could imagine. At just 28, she had already buried most of the people she had loved. Her parents, her children, her half-sister, her husband. What remained was her pen, her son Percy Florence, and the crushing weight of legacy. She was no longer the radical teenager who fled England for love. She was now a widow, a single mother, and a woman surrounded by ghosts. And yet she endured. Financially unstable, Mary relied on her writing to survive. But Victorian society wasn't kind to women who had lived too much. She was judged not only as a female author, but as the scandalous wife of a controversial poet. Publishers wanted her to be palatable, respectable, so she learned to navigate the literary world with care, balancing her radical past with the need to provide a stable life for her son. She wrote tirelessly novels like Perkin, Warbeck, Loder, and Faulkner, each weaving themes of political exile, lost mothers, and moral conflict. They weren't as revolutionary as Frankenstein, but they reflected her evolving perspective, less idealistic, more grounded, and deeply introspective. She also produced biographies, travel journals, and countless editorial projects, including the monumental task of preserving and promoting Percy Shelley's poetry. She shaped his legacy with the same diligence she once used to shape her stories. But Mary wasn't simply a caretaker of memories. She remained intellectually sharp, politically engaged, and fiercely protective of her privacy. She rejected multiple marriage proposals. She refused to publish gossip or expose secrets. She maintained friendships with writers, philosophers, and publishers, but trusted very few. Her greatest devotion was to her son, Percy Florence. She ensured he received the best education, protected him from scandal, and gave him a quiet life she herself had been denied. In doing so, she created a version of stability that had eluded her for decades. Mary's later life was marked by physical illness, recurring headaches, and paralysis in her right arm, but she never stopped writing, never stopped thinking, never stopped being the woman who would stare down grief and defied it with ink and paper. She was the last woman standing, not untouched by tragedy, but undefeated by it. Her life was no longer just a Gothic novel. It was an act of endurance. By the time Mary Shelley reached her 30s, she had become a quiet force in the literary world, not through loud acclaim, but through sheer persistence. She was no longer merely Percy Shelley's widow or the daughter of famous radicals. She was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, a novel that over time had begun to take on a strange life of its own. Frankenstein had first been dismissed by critics. Some saw it as a disturbing oddity. Others assumed it had been written by her husband, but the public couldn't look away. By the 1830s, the story had already begun evolving beyond the page. Theater adaptations sprang up across Europe, including The Popular Presumption or The Fate of Frankenstein, which portrayed the creature as a mute brute, far from Mary's eloquent, tragic original. Still, it proved the novel's cultural power. Her monster was no longer just hers. It belonged to the world. And with that came something extraordinary. A new genre was beginning to form. Frankenstein had unknowingly birthed science fiction. Long before Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, Mary Shelley had asked the terrifying question, what happens when man plays God? She had fused Gothic horror with Enlightenment-era science, threading human tragedy through speculative imagination. It wasn't just a horror story, it was a warning. Mary herself didn't claim to have invented a genre. In fact, she rarely called attention to herself at all. But scholars now regard her as the mother of science fiction, a title she earned not through intention, but innovation. She had taken the anxieties of her era about science, morality, motherhood, and death, and molded them into a timeless parable. As she edited Percy's works and navigated the male-dominated publishing world, Mary quietly influenced generations of thinkers. Her writings explored not only politics and feminism, but ecological disaster, existential dread, and ethical boundaries. Her 1826 novel, The Last Man, imagined a world ravaged by plague and loneliness, a vision that would only be fully appreciated a century later. Though all for much of her later life, she never stopped engaging with the world through her writing. Her legacy was already in motion, creeping out of the lab, across the stage, through the press, and into the bloodstream of modern culture. Mary Shelley had breathed life into an idea that would never die. And for that, literature would never be the same. Mary Shelley's life was shaped not only by love and loss, but by identity, an identity she was constantly forced to defend, reshape, and preserve. Being a woman writer in the 19th century was already a political act. Being Mary Shelley, the daughter of revolutionaries, the widow of a radical poet, the creator of a morally complex monster, made her existence even more loaded. After Percy's death, Mary was left in a precarious position. Though she had taken his surname through their marriage, her status as his literary executor and the guardian of his legacy was not guaranteed. His family, the aristocratic Shelleys, had never approved of Mary. They viewed her with suspicion and considered her dangerous, and offered her a meager allowance on the condition that she stay out of their affairs. They allowed her to raise her son, but not to speak too freely. Mary played a long and careful game. She towed the line between respectability and rebellion, crafting a public persona that was quiet, literary, and maternal, while still protecting her radical lineage beneath the surface when editing Percy's poetry and writing his memoirs. She subtly sanitized his atheism and revolutionary views, ensuring that his works could reach a wider, more conservative Victorian audience. Critics have debated this move for decades. Was it betrayal or strategy? Perhaps it was both. Mary understood the politics of reputation better than most. But while she worked to preserve Percy's legacy, she also fought for her own. Publishers wanted her to be silent, anonymous, or at best, the footnote to her husband's genius. Mary refused. She continued writing novels under her own name. In an era when women were still publishing under male pseudonyms, Mary Shelley insisted on visibility. At the same time, she quietly inserted political themes into her fiction. In Lodore and Faulkner, she explored issues of female autonomy, flawed fatherhood, and the social limitations placed on women in The Last Man. She imagined the collapse of civilization and the futility of empire. Hardly subtle commentary. Mary Shelley's pen was not just a creative tool, it was a weapon. Through fiction, biography, and quiet editorial work, she shaped not only the memory of a generation, but the framework of modern literature. As the Victorian era bloomed around her, Mary Shelley entered her final decade with a quiet dignity shadowed by physical decline and emotional isolation. Though she was still recognized for her intellect and literary contributions, the world that had once swirled with radicalism and romanticism was fading, and Mary was one of its last living witnesses. The vibrant coterie of her youth, Byron, Percy, Clare, even her father, William Godwin, were gone. The revolutionary fire of the early 1800s had given way to Victorian restraint. Mary found herself increasingly alone, burdened by chronic illness. She suffered from debilitating headaches, partial paralysis in her arms, and what may have been a recurring brain tumor. Yet she rarely complained. Her pain was simply folded into her routine, like ink into paper. Still, she remained committed to her son, Percy Florence Shelley, who had grown into a dutiful and affectionate young man. Unlike his parents, Percy Florence lived a conventional life, eventually inheriting the baronet he denied to his father. Mary clung to his companionship, focusing her remaining energy on ensuring his success and protecting him from scandal, especially the ghosts that still followed the Shelley name. Though her days of bold creation were behind her, Mary kept working. She maintained correspondence with publishers, friends, and fellow intellectuals. She continued reading widely history, science, political theory, remaining intellectually engaged even as her body betrayed her. She kept editing Percy's works, carefully curating his poetic legacy, while tiptoeing around the more incendiary pieces to preserve public favor. But the shadows never fully lifted. She lived modestly, sometimes on the edge of poverty, and never remarried. Marriage to Mary was never about security. It had been about passion and shared ideals. No one else could fill the space Percy had occupied, nor would she allow them to try. In 1851, at the age of 53, Mary Shelley died of what was likely a brain tumor. She passed quietly, surrounded by her son and his wife. After her death, they found among her belongings locks of hair from her lost children and a rumored piece of Percy Shelley's heart wrapped in silk. Even in death, Mary Shelley remained a keeper of memory, a woman shaped by loss. Elevated by genius and driven to write through every shadow, Mary Shelley died in 1851, but her voice never went silent. In the decades that followed, her work, especially Frankenstein, grew beyond her wildest imagination. What began as a ghost story by a teenage runaway became one of the most influential novels in human history. Mary Shelley wasn't just remembered. She was resurrected again and again. At first, her fame lingered quietly. During her lifetime, she had been praised mostly for her loyalty to Percy and her editorship of his poetry. Her own fiction, though respected, was often dismissed or misunderstood. Frankenstein was still seen as a curiosity, filed under Gothic horror, its deeper themes ignored by a world not yet ready to question science, morality, and man's place in the universe. But time revealed her genius. By the 20th century, Mary's monster had become a cultural icon. Film adaptations, beginning with the silent era and exploding with Universal's 1931 Frankenstein starring Boris Karloff, gave her creation a new face. Literally, the creature became a misunderstood symbol of modern anxiety, a tragic being forged by human arrogance and cast out by society. Each adaptation reflected the fears of its time: war, technology, nuclear power, artificial intelligence, and always at the core, Mary Shelley's fingerprints. Scholars began to revisit her work with new eyes. Feminist critics championed her not just as the wife of a poet, but as a literary architect in her own right. They explored her insights into motherhood, grief, creation, and power. The Last Man, once overlooked, was reevaluated as an early dystopian masterpiece. Her life itself, marked by rebellion, intellect, and endurance, became as fascinating as her fiction. Today, Mary Shelley is not just remembered, she is revered. She is called the mother of science fiction, the queen of Gothic literature, a pioneer who fused the personal with the philosophical. Her legacy lives on in classrooms, laboratories, film studios, and political discourse. Whenever we ask what it means to be human, or what happens when creation outruns conscience, were speaking in her language. She gave us a monster. But in doing so, she gave voice to every outsider, every orphaned idea, every mind cast out for being too curious. Mary Shelley didn't just write a novel, she rewired literature's DNA. Welcome to Imperial China, where the moment you exit the womb, society politely hands you a roll and then nails it shut. Think of the social system like a multi-tiered cake, except you're the stale bottom layer and the frosting never trickles down. At the very top, the emperor, also known as the Son of Heaven, which is a lovely title until you realize heaven doesn't take complaints. He rules by the mandate of heaven, meaning as long as the crops grow and rebellions stay quiet, his divine status remains unchallenged. If things go wrong, well, guess heaven changed its mind. Time for a new dynasty. Beneath him sit the scholar officials, men who spent most of their lives memorizing Confucian texts, quoting philosophy no one asked for, and developing hunchbacks from a lifetime of bamboo scrolls and social superiority. They passed the imperial exams, which were essentially the SATs if failing meant dying poor forever. Next are the farmers. Yes, the muddy, sun-scorched, underfed backbone of society. Confucian doctrine actually respected them. They fed the empire after all. Unfortunately, respect doesn't come with dental care or lunch breaks. Then come artisans, the people who made stuff with their hands. Paper, porcelain, fans, frustration. Useful? Absolutely. Respected? Not so much. But hey, at least they weren't merchants. Merchants. Richer than everyone. Trusted by no one. According to Confucian values, making a profit off other people's labor was morally slippery. So you could be dripping in silk and silver, but still be treated like a tax-evading raccoon in a brocade robe. Then we reach the societal basement. Soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, and criminals. Basically anyone you wouldn't want to sit next to at a formal banquet. Oh, and monks. Somewhere in a gray area between holy man and why are you bald and barefoot in public? And finally women. Not even on the pyramid. They were more like the gravel surrounding it. Born to obey their fathers, handed off to obey their husbands, and expected to produce sons who could someday obey more men. So if you were born in Imperial China and hope to follow your dreams, society has one answer. That's adorable. Now get back to work. Your day in Imperial China starts bright and early. Not because you're a morning person, but because the rooster is screaming and the village bell is clanging like it's trying to summon the afterlife. You open your eyes, stretch your limbs, and then immediately remember, you're not allowed to just exist. First, you bow not to some abstract deity or noble ideal, to your dad, then your mom, then your grandpa, possibly to your great-aunt if she's still breathing. This is filial piety, and it's not just encouraged, it's mandatory. Forget to bow. That's not being rude. That's inviting cosmic shame onto 7 generations of your bloodline. And you don't just bow once. You bow in stages. You bow when you wake up. You bow before eating. You bow when someone older than you coughs in your direction. If you're not bowing at least 6 times before breakfast, are you even Chinese? Now say you accidentally speak out of turn during morning tea. Maybe you asked a question like, why do I have to wash uncle's feet? Well, congratulations, you've now committed unfilial conduct, which is one small notch above public arson in terms of social disgrace. Better start rehearsing your apology with 3 full kowtows and an optional forehead-to-floor touch. And yes, the furniture is judging you too. Most households didn't have chairs unless they were rich, so you're kneeling on woven mats, trying not to collapse while your elders launch into 45-minute monologues about respect, discipline, how the world went downhill ever since the last dynasty. Let's not forget the Confucian hierarchy chart, the spiritual PowerPoint slide that dictates who gets to talk, sit, or breathe first. Age beats youth. Men outrank women. Fathers outrank everyone. Even among siblings, older ones can talk over you. If you're the youngest, just nod, smile, and hope you're not blamed for something someone else did. There is no good morning in Imperial China. There is only a series of respectful rituals and a quiet prayer that today you won't accidentally offend someone and get disowned. You bowed approximately 47 times before 7 a.m. Congratulations, you've survived the opening ceremony of the day. Now it's time for breakfast, the most important meal of the day, to remind you that life is suffering. So what's on the menu? Let's see a steaming bowl of rice gruel, also known as congee, which is a generous way of saying hot, wet, nothing. It's made by boiling rice in water until the rice gives up and becomes soup. If you're lucky, it has a little salt. If you're really lucky, a stray sliver of pickled vegetable floats by like a rare koi. If your family is on the poorer end of the spectrum, and let's face it, that bowl of congee is about as exciting as your social prospects. You eat it quietly, respectfully, and under the silent judgment of at least one grandparent who remembers when even gruel was a luxury. Me, don't even ask. That's for festivals, weddings, and imperial officials who haven't visited a rice paddy since the Han Dynasty. Eggs are possible, but they're usually preserved in salt or ash until they resemble fossilized sadness if someone brings out pork belly. You immediately check for visiting relatives or divine intervention. Tea is served, of course, not for relaxation, but because plain water is suspect. Tea, at least, has been boiled and thus statistically less likely to kill you. You sip it slowly, even though your stomach is still wondering when the meal actually started. Meanwhile, you eat in silence. Meals are not for chatter. You don't discuss dreams, goals, or how you cried last night thinking about the imperial exam. You eat facing the ancestral shrine, silently thankful for your ancestors, even if they left you a thatched roof, chronic anemia, and impossible family expectations. The bowls are rough ceramic. The spoons are made of wood. There is no napkin. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve if it's clean enough and get ready to start working off the meal you barely consumed, and as you rise, your father nods once. Eat quickly. Heaven favors the diligent, which roughly translates to get back to work. We've got dynasties to maintain. You've finished your bowl of existential porridge, and now it's time to get dressed. Not to impress, but to not get fined, flogged, or mistaken for a social class above your station. Because in imperial China, what you wear isn't about self-expression. It's about survival. Let's start with the fabric hierarchy. Are you a farmer? Hemp. Coarse, itchy, scratchy hemp. The medieval equivalent of wearing a potato sack dipped in disappointment. Are you a noble? Silk. Glorious, shimmering silk that flows like poetry and whispers. Tax the peasants more. And guess what? If you're caught wearing the wrong fabric, you're not just unfashionable. You're committing a crime. Clothing wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was law. The government had detailed regulations on sleeve width, hat shape, belt ornaments, and even color. Yellow, for instance, was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Where yellow is a commoner and you're not starting a fashion trend, you're starting your own execution. Let's talk about footwear. Cloth shoes for peasants, embroidered silk slippers for the elite. Practicality optional. Comfort unlikely. You didn't dress for the weather. You dressed for the dynasty. And now the feet, specifically foot binding, the aesthetic equivalent of turning your toes into a curled-up secret. If you were a high-born girl, your feet were broken, folded under and bound tightly from the age of 5. Why? Because tiny deformed feet are called lotus feet. Were considered beautiful. A woman's worth was literally measured by how effectively she could hobble across a room without falling. It wasn't just painful, it was permanent. Foot binding crippled generations of women, turning walking into an act of art and agony. But don't worry, at least you got to wear embroidered shoes no one ever saw, because walking far wasn't really an option anymore. Even men didn't escape wardrobe misery. Bureaucrats wore heavy layered robes year-round, even in summer, because status always outranked sweat. Some outfits even had winged hat flaps designed to keep officials from whispering to each other during court. So yes, imperial Chinese fashion was elegant, symbolic, and deeply political, but it also chafed, pinched, overheated, or outright shattered your bones. Beauty is pain, they say, but here, pain was mandatory, and beauty was a government-approved dress code. You're now properly dressed in your socially acceptable potato fiber tunic. Great time to head out and earn your daily calories, assuming the land, whether and taxes allow it. Let's be honest. In imperial China, work wasn't a calling. It was a never-ending endurance test designed by Confucius and enforced by people who've never touched a shovel in their lives. If you're a farmer, and statistically, you are, you'll spend your entire life bent over a rice paddy. Not in a poetic, cinematic way. No, this is literal backbreaking labor. You wake up before the sun, plant seedlings knee-deep in muck, sweat away mosquitoes the size of small birds, and pray the landlord doesn't increase your grain tax again this year. Rain. You work. Drought. You work harder. Locusts work and scream at the sky simultaneously. The tools are basic. A wooden plow if you're lucky. Your bare hands if you're not. Your ox is your best friend and your retirement plan. Lose him, and it's just you versus 10 acres of disappointment. Now let's say you're a woman. Your workload has a sequel. You'll help in the fields and cook, clean, spin, thread, weave fabric, raise children, and somehow still be blamed when dinner is late or your husband sneezes wrong. Rest. That's something noble ladies do while debating poetry. Artisans don't have it much better. You spend hours making pottery, paper, or tools by hand, then sell them for barely enough to buy stale tofu and merchants, technically richer but socially shamed. You could buy half the village and still be treated like a walking moral failure. Then there's corvée labor, government-mandated service. One day the emperor may need a new road, canal, or tomb. Guess who's helping build it for free with a smile and no shoes? You. Refuse, and you're branded a criminal, or worse, a rebel. And at the end of it all, you trudge home, covered in dirt to a bowl of thin porridge and the quiet satisfaction of not dying today. In imperial China, work doesn't set you free. It just keeps you too tired to rebel. The imperial exam system, the grand gateway to upward mobility. Or, as it's more accurately known, the eternal written torture chamber of China. If you were a man born with a sliver of ambition and a family slightly wealthier than dirt, your life path was clear. Pass the civil service exam. Succeed, and you become an official. Respected, powerful, with silk robes and actual chairs to sit on. Fail. Back to the rice field, peasants. Simple, not even close. These exams were less multiple choice and more memorize the entire Confucian canon word for word, and write poetic essays that would make a 1,000-year-old ghost weep. Imagine being judged not just on grammar and meaning, but on whether your handwriting flows like a morally upright river. One smudge, one character out of place, one metaphor too edgy. Instant failure. Studying began in early childhood and didn't stop until your hairline did. Boys crammed inside freezing study huts or boiled themselves alive in summer, scribbling out essays until their fingers curled permanently into brush-holding claws. Tutors drilled doctrine into your skull like academic blacksmiths. Your social life? Gone. Your hobbies? Confucius. Your dreams? Still Confucius. The top exam, the Jinshi, was held in the capital. You were locked in a cubicle the size of a coffin with nothing but paper, ink, and soul-crushing anxiety. You brought your own food, blanket, and chamber pot. Some examinees fainted. Others went mad. A few died. Yes, literally died from the pressure, and they weren't even given partial credit. Even if you passed the first round, more exams awaited. District, provincial, national. Years could go by. Decades. Some men tested into their 60s. One guy reportedly took the exam more than 40 times. That's not determination. That's trauma with a calligraphy pen. And if you failed, social shame. Your family, who sacrificed everything for your education, will be disappointed, and loudly so. Your neighbors would whisper. Your mother might cry. Your father might give you the look. You know the one. Why weren't you born smarter? Stay. So yes, the exam could lift you to greatness or break your mind, your body, and your lineage. All for the chance to be overworked, underpaid, and micromanaged by palace eunuchs. Is it worth it? That's up to Confucius. Feeling dirty yet? Don't worry, you will. Because in imperial China, personal hygiene wasn't so much a lifestyle as it was a seasonal suggestion. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. It happens sometimes. Maybe once every few weeks if you were lucky and not freezing to death. In summer, sure. Dip in the river in winter. You might go a month without a proper wash, and no, there was no lavender-scented soap. Soap, when used, was made from animal fat and ashes, a gritty blend that felt like exfoliating with misery. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in larger cities, but privacy wasn't really a thing. You'd be scrubbing your armpits next to an elderly merchant and a shrieking toddler while a monk recited hygiene proverbs in the corner. Refreshing toothpaste. Try salt, charcoal, or powdered bones. Toothbrushes were made from animal hair tied to bamboo, effective only if your goal was to mildly disturb your plaque into relocating. Dental hygiene wasn't great, which is probably why most older adults smiled like haunted jack-o'-lanterns. And then there were the parasites, lice, fleas, bedbugs. These were less pests and more roommates. It didn't matter how rich you were. If you had hair, you had company. Comb shops flourished because everyone needed a lice comb. And if you didn't, you scratched your scalp like you were trying to summon lightning. Clothing wasn't helping. You wore the same outfit for weeks. Washing clothes required hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, and praying your shirt didn't disintegrate into fibers. Underwear existed, but it wasn't a daily requirement, especially for peasants who often wore none at all. Risky business. And don't forget the toilets or actually do it for your own sake. A toilet was typically a hole in the ground, occasionally surrounded by wooden boards if you were fancy public latrines, functional in the same way a haunted well is functional, smelly, crowded, and always one step away from biological disaster. Imperial China had silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces. But if you wanted a long, hot private shower, you were about 1,500 years too early. So you've survived the lice, the breakfast disappointment, and the soul-crushing exam prep. But before you even think about complaining to your neighbor, remember in Imperial China the law is always watching, and unlike modern surveillance, this one comes with bamboo sticks and very creative punishments. Let's begin with the legal code. Imperial dynasties, particularly during the Tang and Qing periods, were known for having exhaustively detailed laws. There were laws about taxes, hairstyles, hat shapes, how to grieve properly, and how long you were allowed to mourn your in-laws. Accidentally wear the wrong color on the wrong festival day. Technically criminal. And yes, they kept receipts, official bamboo strip records inked and filed by overworked scribes who probably hated their job. Punishment wasn't subtle. Forget modern courtrooms and community service. Imperial justice believed in education through suffering. For minor offenses, you might get flogged with a bamboo rod. Fun fact, the court even had different sizes of sticks depending on the crime. Light insult. Small stick. Stole a chicken. Bigger stick. Failed to bow deeply enough to a magistrate horse. Surprise stick combo for more serious crimes. Things escalated quickly. You could be branded, tattooed on the face with your crime, sent into exile, or if you really upset someone important, executed in public slowly. Torture wasn't an exception. It was a procedure if you were accused of something. The court would often help encourage your confession with thumbscrews, kneeling on spiked boards, or long hours in a stressed position while being shouted at by a man with a scroll and no sense of humor. And here's the best part. You didn't even have to be guilty, just suspicious, inconvenient, or politically unlucky. Even your family could be held accountable. The law loved collective punishment if your cousin said something seditious during a rice wine binge. You might wake up to find your house under investigation because guilt, apparently, was hereditary. The law was structured. It was advanced. It was terrifying. Justice in Imperial China was less about fairness and more about obedience. The message was clear. Babe, respect the order. And whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the magistrate's concubine. Welcome to the imperial justice system's favorite hobby, torture. Not as a punishment, but as a handy pre-trial icebreaker. Let's say someone accuses you of stealing a chicken, disrespecting your father, or heaven forbid, expressing a controversial opinion about the emperor's poetry. The magistrate doesn't start by asking for your side of the story. No, no, this is Imperial China. You start by getting tied to a bench while they bring out the confession toolkit. First up, the bamboo rod used for beating your back, buttocks, or thighs until you're sorry for crimes you may not even understand. It wasn't random violence. They kept official punishment logs, counting every stroke with bureaucratic precision. 30 lashes for theft, 45 for lying, one bonus lash for squirming. Still denying guilt. Time to upgrade. Kneeling on spiked boards was a classic. You kneel on rough wood embedded with stones or glass until your legs give out or your will does. It's a little like yoga if yoga were invented by angry civil servants. Then there's the finger crusher, 2 slabs of wood tightened with rope around your fingers. Fun fact, it was called a small tiger bench, which sounds adorable until your bones snap like kindling. It's hard to write a confession with broken fingers. But they didn't really care about penmanship. And yes, this was standard procedure. Torture wasn't, been as morally questionable. It was simply the most efficient way to get the truth, or at least a version of it that matched the official narrative. If you still wouldn't confess, they'd just escalate. Some punishments involved being stretched, whipped, or left tied up in the summer sun while officials took a lunch break. And don't bother screaming. The neighbors are used to it. Now imagine you're innocent. Congratulations, you still get tortured. Because a clean confession was needed for proper record keeping. Better to admit to something than risk being labeled uncooperative. Imperial logic at its finest. So next time you complain about modern bureaucracy, remember, at least the DMV doesn't beat you with bamboo until you admit you might have parked improperly in 1372. You may think you're alone, but in Imperial China, someone is always watching. And no, it's not just your judgmental grandmother. The surveillance state wasn't digital. It was human, carefully trained, state-approved, and terrifyingly thorough. It began at the village level, where every town had a local baojiang, or village elder, who wasn't just there to hand out rice. He was also your friendly neighborhood informant. Your neighbors, also spies. Your extended family? Absolutely spies. Your servant, who claims to be illiterate and deaf? Definitely a spy. People were incentivized to report suspicious behavior, and suspicious could mean anything from hoarding too much grain to coughing during a tribute speech. Even staying too quiet could raise eyebrows. Were you hiding, citizen? In the cities, you had a sophisticated network of yamen runner scribes and magistrate assistants whose job was to investigate crimes, deliver messages, and casually observe everything you did. Every dynasty had its own version of this machine, but the goal remained the same. Keep the peace by peeking through every available crack. Especially fond of surveillance were the eunuchs in the imperial palace, those castrated courtiers who couldn't father children but absolutely could start coups. Many controlled their own secret police forces, operated spy rings, and whispered in the ears of emperors. Some eunuchs wielded more power than ministers simply by knowing who said what to whom and when. And don't even try complaining about the system. Criticizing the emperor even indirectly, like saying the sun looks a little tired today, could be interpreted as slander. Poets learned to master the art of subtlety. Everyone else just mastered the art of shutting up. What's worse? The government often published lists of executed criminals as a warning, complete with names and crimes. It was like an ancient Facebook feed, but with more beheadings. So if you had a rebellious thought, you kept it to yourself. If you had a rebellious cousin, you turned him in. And if someone smiled too wide while asking about your political opinions, that was your cue to fake a cough and run. Because in Imperial China, the walls had ears, and so did the trees, the neighbors, and probably your rice bowl. In Imperial China, marriage was not about falling in love under the cherry blossoms. It was about duty, negotiation, and dowries so heavy they could break your ox guard's axle. Love? That was for poems, not people. Let's start with the basics. Marriages were always arranged. Parents decided your fate while you were still learning how to hold chopsticks. If your family had status, they'd hire a matchmaker, a professional snoop who compared horoscopes, family records, and whether your future spouse's ancestors had ever done anything embarrassing 5 dynasties ago. If everything aligned, congratulations, you're engaged to someone you've probably never met. Physical attraction, personality, shared interests, irrelevant. Compatibility was measured in birth charts and tax records. For women, marriage wasn't an exciting new chapter. It was a polite kidnapping with ceremonial robes. You left your family forever, changed your surname, and moved into your husband's home, where you were now expected to serve not only him, but his parents, his grandparents, and whatever cranky uncle happened to be living in the guest room. The dowry system meant your family had to send money, goods, or land with you. The more, the better. Think of it as ancient China's version of thanks for taking her off our hands. In return, the groom's family might give betrothal gifts, but don't get too excited. Sometimes that meant silks and jewelry. Other times, a slightly nicer chicken. Once married, your job was clear. Produce male heirs, obey your in-laws, and never, ever talk back. A wife was expected to be modest, silent, and hardworking. The holy trinity of Confucian womanhood. If you were too loud, too opinionated, or heaven forbid, barren, you might get replaced legally with a concubine. Speaking of which, yes, concubinage was a thing. Men could take multiple concubines, especially if they were rich. Women, one man, one shot at survival. Divorce, rare. Social suicide. The only acceptable grounds were 7 outs, including jealousy, disease, or excessive gossip. So if your tea drinking habits annoyed your husband enough, he could legally dump you. Nice. In short, marriage in Imperial China was less happy ever after, and more try not to get exiled for serving cold noodles. So you're thinking of rebelling. Maybe you're tired of back-breaking labor, endless bowing. Or that smug magistrate who taxed your rice and your dignity in the same afternoon. Bold move. Unfortunately, in Imperial China, rebellion didn't make you a hero. It made you a very short-lived headline. Let's start with fantasy. You gather a ragtag band of peasants, earn your landlord's tax ledgers, and proclaim a glorious new era of justice. The problem? The Imperial Army arrives 3 days later with horses, crossbows, and no sense of humor. You see, the emperors weren't just bureaucrats in gold hats. They were obsessed with stability. Confucian ideology taught that rebellion meant disorder, and disorder meant the universe was out of whack. That made you not just a criminal, but a cosmic threat. And the punishment for cosmic threats? Dramatic. You'd be captured, paraded, tortured, and often executed in a way specifically designed to discourage creative thinking. Public beheadings were popular. So was quartering. One emperor preferred slow slicing, a charming method where you were cut repeatedly until your paperwork and your torso were complete. And it didn't stop with you. The imperial government loved a good collective punishment. Your family, your neighbors, even that one guy who once lent you a hoe. They were all fair game. The logic was simple. If we erase your entire village, no one will rebel again. Effective, terrifying. Still, rebellions did happen. From the Yellow Turban Rebellion to the White Lotus Uprising, desperate people occasionally rose up, and while some sparked chaos, most were brutally crushed. The survivors were either enslaved, silenced, or drafted into public works projects they wouldn't survive long enough to finish. Even talking about rebellion was dangerous. Writing a sassy poem that hinted at discontent. Boom. Arrested. Confess under bamboo interrogation. If you're lucky, you get exiled to the outer provinces to think about your actions somewhere cold, rocky, and strategically flea-infested. So yes, rebellion sounded romantic. The stuff of dramas and legends. But in reality, you were more likely to become a cautionary tale carved onto a public plaque. Want to change the system? Best to keep your head down. Literally. So maybe you thought, if I can't make it as a peasant, maybe I'll rise through the ranks, ace the exams, and live a comfortable life as a government official. Adorable. Welcome to court life in Imperial China, where, yes, the tea is hot. The robes are silk, and the palace floors are polished to a divine shine, but so are the knives hiding behind everyone's backs. Let's begin with the Forbidden City, the Emperor's heavily guarded wonderland. Inside, everyone is smiling and plotting. Eunuchs, ministers, concubines, scholar officials. all locked in a constant game of polite treachery. The only thing more cutthroat than court life was actual throat cutting, which also happened a lot. If you were an official, your every move was watched not just by spies, but by rivals waiting for you to mess up. File a report with the wrong character. Treason. Mispronounce the emperor's name during a reading. Treason. Hesitate before kneeling. Treason adjacent at the very least. And let's talk about eunuchs, castrated palace servants who wielded disproportionate power. Many started humbly, rose swiftly, and became gatekeepers to the emperor's inner world. Upset a eunuch. You might find your promotion mysteriously delayed, or your name added to a secret accidental disappearance list. Meanwhile, the imperial harem wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a high-stakes political battlefield. Concubines vied for favor, sabotaged rivals, and hoped to birth a prince, preferably one who didn't get poisoned before age 5. The empress might technically be in charge, but good luck controlling 30 jealous women with nothing to do but scheme creatively. Even poetry was risky. Compose the wrong metaphor about wilting flowers or a crumbling wall, and someone might decide you're criticizing the emperor. There were officials executed for writing poems about the weather because the emperor took the hint, and when the emperor died. Oh, now the real fun began. Succession disputes, secret wills, mysterious deaths, unfortunate illnesses. Half the court usually didn't survive the transition. So no, court life wasn't safer. It was just death in a silk wrapper. Your robe might be red, but so was the floor beneath it. You've made it this far, bowed, bled, memorized 400 Confucian sayings, and dodged at least 3 types of death. But here's the grand truth about life in imperial China. You were a statistic, head count, a line item on a dusty tax ledger. To the empire, you were not a person with hopes and dreams. You were a grain of rice, small, anonymous, easily crushed, and ideally harvested for labor or revenue. The state didn't care if you had ambition, talent, or inner beauty. It cared if your family paid its taxes on time and produced able-bodied sons to draft into the next border defense project. From the emperor's viewpoint, you were one speck among hundreds of millions, and not even a glamorous speck. You weren't the golden imperial seal or a sacred relic. You were a moving part in a rice-producing, silk-spinning, canal-digging machine built to sustain dynastic continuity. Your birth was recorded not for celebration, but for future tax extraction. Your death was noted mostly so your family wouldn't keep trying to claim your rations. And in between, your life's purpose was to not cause problems, stay in line, fulfill your role, and try not to starve during a drought. Individualism. Cute idea. It didn't exist. You didn't follow your passion. You followed your father, your master, or your assigned bureaucratic rank. The idea of being unique. Standing out was as threatening to the state as a crop blight or a Mongol invasion. Harmony was everything. Even your emotions were expected to be in line with your social status. Feeling sad as a peasant? Acceptable. Feeling inspired? Sit down. The census didn't ask what your favorite poem was. It asked if your roof leaked and whether you owned a pig. Even your body belonged to the system. Drafted for public works, you might be sent to build a canal you'd never benefit from, or guard a wall you'd never see finished. Die along the way. No problem. There were always more grains where you came from. In imperial China, you mattered, but only as long as you could be counted, taxed, or buried quietly. So here we are, 15 chapters deep. And if you've been paying attention, one thing is clear. Imperial China was magnificent, and magnificently merciless. Yes, this civilization gave the world some of its most profound inventions. Gunpowder, paper, a compass, printing, bureaucracy that actually worked. Mostly the Great Wall snaked across mountains. The Forbidden City stood like a jewel of imperial will, and poetry flowed like the Yellow River. Beautiful, endless, and often fatal if interpreted incorrectly. The legacy is unmatched. The reality is backbreaking, hierarchical, and constantly one bad rice harvest away from collapse. For every elegant brushstroke recorded in a scholar's diary, there were 10,000 peasants ankle-deep in mud, wondering whether this year's tax grain would leave anything left to eat. For every emperor buried beneath a mountain of jade and gold, there were hundreds of laborers buried beneath the same mountain because they were inconvenient witnesses. The brilliance of imperial China didn't come cheap. It was paid for in childhoods, lost to exam study, backspent from field work, and lives cut short by law, famine, or conscription. The system worked brilliantly for the top few. For everyone else, it worked them until they collapsed. And the worst part, most of them accepted it. Not because they loved oppression, but because the system had convinced them it was the natural order of things, that heaven had appointed their emperor, that filial piety, obedience, and silence were virtues, that suffering quietly was a form of virtue. That legacy, the duality of splendor and suffering, is what still echoes today. When people look back at imperial China, they often see the calligraphy, the architecture, the philosophical quotes carved into stone. They don't always see the concubine poison in the harem, the starving mother selling her comb for rice, or the scholar who failed the exam for the seventh time and simply disappeared. So no, you wouldn't last a day in imperial China. Not because you're soft, but because that world wasn't built for survival. It was built for endurance, tradition, and control. And yet, through it all, the empire endured. The people endured. But only a few of their stories were ever told. In the spring of 1846, the Great Westward Migration was in full swing. The Oregon Trail pulsed with life, oxen trudging, wagon wheels creaking, and families dreaming of new beginnings. Among these travelers was a group of roughly 30 people led by brothers George and Jacob Donner and businessman James F. Reed. They weren't fortune seekers or adventurers. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and children chasing the promise of California's fertile valleys. Their timing seemed perfect. The snows wouldn't fall for months, and the well-worn Path W had carried thousands before them. But the Donner Party, later numbering 87 people, made one critical error that would set them on a path toward tragedy. They chose to take a shortcut. This so-called shortcut was the Hastings Cutoff, an untested route promoted by Lansford Hastings, an opportunist who had never even traveled it himself with a wagon. It promised to shave weeks off the journey by cutting through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had sent guides ahead to leave letters encouraging immigrants to take his new route. The Donner Party, trusting those letters, left the traditional trail and followed his suggestion. At first, spirits remained high. The group included children, elderly parents, and entire families who sang hymns at night and held tight to hope. But trouble began quickly. The Wasatch Mountains were far more treacherous than Hastings claimed. The wagons had to be dismantled, hauled piece by piece, and reassembled. Progress slowed to a crawl. Tempers flared, supplies dwindled. Then came the desert. The Great Salt Lake Desert was a brutal, shimmering hell. Hastings had said it would take 2 days to cross. It took 5. Water barrels ran dry. Animals collapsed. Oxen went mad. Entire wagons were abandoned in the alkaline dust. They had already lost precious time, and winter was no longer far behind them. By the time they rejoined the main trail, they had lost weeks. Other wagon trains were already over the Sierra Nevada. The Donner Party, exhausted and behind schedule, pushed onward, unaware that the most harrowing part of their journey still lay ahead. The dream of California was still in their minds. But the mountains didn't care about dreams, and soon neither would starvation. By late October 1846, the Donner Party finally reached the eastern base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was supposed to be the last great obstacle before descending into California's promised lands. But the mountains weren't just high. They were merciless, and winter was arriving early. The party was now fractured. Some families had forged ahead while others, including the Donners and the Reeds, lagged behind, slowed by broken wagons, injured oxen, and sheer exhaustion. Snow began to fall, light at first, then relentless. Within days, the passes became impassable. They were trapped. They camped at Truckee Lake, what's now called Donner Lake, and others stopped further back at Alder Creek. Makeshift cabins were built from pine logs and wagon parts. They slaughtered their remaining animals. Hides were turned into crude tents. The snow kept falling over 6 feet, then 10. The hunger came quickly. Rations were reduced. The livestock was gone. They boiled strips of rawhide and gnawed on leather belts. One child tried to eat a blanket. Another chewed on a piece of bark until their gums bled. Every morning brought another cold body. Death moved slowly, politely, then cruelly. Inside those cabins, there was no warmth, just smoke, hunger, and silence. Mothers tried to comfort starving children. Fathers stared out into the endless snow, calculating how far they might get on foot. Arguments broke out, hope thin like the mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow piled up to the roofs. Trees snapped under the weight. Any thought of escape was buried under white silence. The past was closed, and the dream of California was gone, replaced by a desperate singular thought of survival. By mid-December, with no rescue in sight, 15 of the strongest members formed what would be called the Forlorn Hope Party. 10 men and 5 women strapped crude snowshoes to their feet and attempted to cross the mountains on foot, carrying meager rations, and the unbearable burden of what might come next. Behind them, dozens remained at camp, starving, dying, and waiting in a frozen purgatory. And for the Forlorn Hope, the question wasn't if they would survive. It was who would die first and who would eat them. On December 16, 1846, 15 desperate souls stepped into the snow and vanished into history. They were dubbed the Forlorn Hope, not by the newspapers, but by their fellow emigrants who watched them go, knowing full well what the word forlorn meant. Lost, hopeless, doomed. Each member carried only what they could. Scraps of dried ox hide, flint, a rifle, and shredded blankets. They built crude snowshoes, hoping to stay above the deep drifts, but it barely worked. The snow was powdery and endless. They slogged for miles each day, slowed by exhaustion and the icy grip of high-altitude wilderness. Within days they were lost. The food ran out almost immediately. They had miscalculated the distance. A squirrel was caught, a pine cone boiled, and then a man collapsed. Franklin Graves, the oldest in the group. His daughters sobbed as he died in the snow. There was nothing they could do. And then, one by one, others began to fall. Antonia, the Mexican teamster. Patrick Dolan, raving and delirious. Lemuel Murphy, just 13. Death came not as a storm, but as a slow hush. It was silent, white, inescapable. Then came the moment. The line crossed in desperation and cold logic. The survivors carved meat from their fallen companions. They wept, prayed, vomited, and ate again. It wasn't savagery. It was calculus. Starve or live. Sarah Graves, just 19, later recalled the first taste. She never spoke of it again. William Foster, gaunt and silent, kept his thoughts to himself. Marion Graves held her sister's hand and whispered that it didn't matter what they had to do so long as they got home. By the time they stumbled out of the mountains weeks later, only 7 had survived. 5 women and 2 men. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks frostbitten, their mouths silent. But they brought something far more powerful than supplies or maps. They brought news. There were dozens still alive, trapped at Donner Lake, starving, freezing, waiting, and they needed help now. California, which had largely ignored the Donner mess, suddenly woke up. The horror was too great, the shame too large. Rescue parties were organized, but by the time they arrived, the snow had grown even deeper, and in the cabins by the lake, what they would find was beyond imagining. The first rescue party arrived at Donner Lake in February 1847, 2 months after the Forlorn Hope emerged from the mountains. What they found wasn't a camp, it was a graveyard. Cabins were half buried in snow, doors frozen shut. Inside, people sat motionless, too weak to stand, their eyes glazed over from starvation. Children lay beside their dead parents. Frozen bodies were stacked like firewood. And the smell, thick, sickly, unforgettable, spoke of what had happened when the meat ran out. Some tried to speak, others simply stared. Of the 87 who had started the journey, nearly half were dead, and those still breathing were barely human anymore. Gaunt, skeletal figures wrapped in filthy hides, whispering prayers to an indifferent sky. The rescuers had brought supplies. flour, dried meat, blankets, but not enough to save everyone. There was no way to carry dozens through snow drifts taller than wagons. They had to make impossible decisions. Children were chosen first, the smallest, the lightest. Those with the greatest chance of surviving the trek back down the mountains. Parents stayed behind, watching silently as strangers carried away their children, unsure if they'd ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions followed. Each had to battle whiteouts, avalanches, and terrain that had swallowed the Donapati whole. With every return trip, the rescuers brought fewer supplies and found fewer survivors and darker stories. The truth began to leak out, not just of starvation, but of cannibalism, of how in the worst nights, when all was lost, some survivors had fed on the dead. Some even whispered that others had killed to feed. The names were kept quiet, the rumors louder than the facts. Some were judged, others pitied. Most were simply too traumatized to speak. James Reed, who had been banished early in the journey for killing a man in self-defense, returned as a rescuer. Against all odds, he found his wife and children still alive. George Donner, however, lay dying at Alder Creek, his arm gangrenous. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave him. She stayed behind when the others left and never made it out. When the final survivors reached California in April 1847, the ordeal was over. But the scars, emotional, cultural, and historical, were just beginning to form. News of the Donner Party's ordeal spread east like wildfire, twisting with each retelling, growing darker, more grotesque. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it. America, gripped by manifest destiny fever, was suddenly staring at its shadow. The story was too irresistible. Pioneers chasing paradise turned cannibals in the snow. Some headlines called it the cannibal horror of the Sierra. Others accused survivors of murder. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a national reckoning. The westward expansion had always been sold as glorious, godly, and inevitable, but now it was stained with the image of starving settlers roasting human flesh over pinewood fires. Journalists fixated on every ghastly detail. Who ate whom, who died nobly, and who took too long to die. Sarah Graves, one of the survivors, was hounded for interviews. So was Mary Murphy, who lost almost her entire family. Survivors were caught between fame and shame, praised for surviving, yet judged for how they did it. James Reed, once a disgraced exile, returned to San Jose, a changed man, haunted but vindicated. His leadership during the rescue missions earned him public sympathy, and he spent much of his later life trying to protect the reputations of the survivors. But even he couldn't silence the whispers. Tamsin Donner became a tragic symbol, a devoted wife who stayed behind with her dying husband, refusing rescue more than once. When she finally tried to leave with a group of men, she never made it. Her fate was murky. Some said she died of a cold. Others suggested she had been killed and eaten by the very men she trusted. The government, for its part, said little. California was on the brink of becoming U.S. territory, and the last thing officials wanted was to tarnish the dream of westward expansion. The incident was brushed aside as an unfortunate tragedy, an anomaly, no inquiry, no formal investigation. And yet, in every parlor and saloon, people talked about the Donners. The name itself became a cautionary tale. Children were warned. Don't take shortcuts. Don't stray from the trail, or you might end up like them. But beneath the horror, something more complex lingered. Questions about survival, morality, and just how thin the veneer of civilization really is when the snow won't stop falling. For those who lived through the Sierra Nightmare, the journey didn't end when the snow melted. Survival came at a price, etched into bone and memory. The survivors emerged from the mountains, but they never truly left them behind. Many were children. They returned to civilization as walking ghosts, quiet, underfed, wide-eyed. Some, like Virginia Reed, just 13 at the time, would go on to live long lives. She eventually married, had children, and even published letters recounting her ordeal. But beneath her composed surface lay trauma that pulsed like an old wound. Others fared worse. Mary Murphy, after losing her entire family, married young and died within a few years. Louis Kesselberg, a German immigrant who had been among the last rescued, was branded forever by rumors that he had not only consumed the dead, but murdered them to do so. He sued a newspaper for libel and won $1 in damages. It didn't matter. The stain never left him. Some survivors tried to disappear. They changed their names, moved far from California, or refused to speak about what happened. Others couldn't stop talking, haunted not just by what they'd done, but by what they'd seen others do. It wasn't just cannibalism. It was the slow unraveling of humanity, watching friends wither into skeletons, hearing the silent weeping of mothers who could no longer feed their children, choosing who to save when rescue came, because there was never room for all. Communities, too, reacted differently. Some treated the survivors with pity and respect, acknowledging their suffering as heroic endurance. Others whispered and gossiped, eager to distance themselves from what had become a living nightmare etched into the American frontier myth. James Reed, to his credit, rebuilt his reputation. He served in the Mexican-American War, prospered in San Jose, and lived to an old age. But even he admitted in letters that the images of the dead, the sounds of the camp, stayed with him always. No one who survived the Donner Party returned unchanged. Whether they were 8 or 80, they had stared into the void of desperation and made choices. Most people pray they'll never face. And in that silence between hunger and horror, they left behind a truth few wanted to admit. Survival is not always clean. It is not always noble. Sometimes it simply means living with what you had to become. The Sierra Nevada never forgot the Donnas. The lake, where many of them waited out the blizzards, where they died, starved, and fed, is now known as Donner Lake, a postcard of natural beauty with a name that hums with unease. Over time, the landscape became part of the legend. Tourists came to see the site where the cabins once stood, to walk the snowy trails where the forlorn hope had trudged, to gaze at the mountains that had refused to let the pioneers pass. Locals told stories. Some whispered that the place was cursed, that the trees still remembered, that the winds carried voices. In 1918, a granite monument was erected near the lake. On top stand a solemn pioneer family, father, mother, and child, facing westward, ever hopeful. The pedestal beneath them is 22 feet tall. Marking the height of the snow that winter, it's a monument to endurance, to tragedy, to the thin line between civilization and survival. But even in stone, the story remains uneasy. The monument says nothing of cannibalism, nothing of the quiet desperation, betrayals, or the dead who were consumed to keep others alive. It's a sanitized memory, one designed for public comfort, not historical truth. Every year, school children visit the site. They hear the basic version. Pioneers trapped, survived. Maybe a mention of starvation. Rarely the rest. It's easier to honor your grip than to stare into the face of what survival costs. Still, the mountains remember the paths they took are still there, buried under ski resorts and hiking trails. The spot where Tams and Donna stayed behind with her dying husband. Now a picnic area, the frozen cabin where children wept in silence, replaced by interpretive plaques. And yet the air feels heavy, as if the ground still holds the memory of boots crunching over snow, of mothers rocking dead infants, of strangers sharing meat with trembling hands and averted eyes. Nature doesn't care. It offers no apologies, but the story persists. Not just because it's horrifying, but because it's human. The Donner Party wasn't just about failure or cannibalism. It was about how far people will go to protect their families, to cling to hope, to choose life, even in its most terrible form. And in the silence of the mountains, that choice still echoes. In the decades that followed, the story of the Donner Party evolved, warped by memory, distorted by gossip, and reshaped by the needs of a nation addicted to drama. The facts were gruesome enough, but that didn't stop storytellers from making them worse, or in some cases, more heroic. Some survivors were romanticized, cast as tragic pioneers who had faced hell and returned with scars. Others, like Louis Keseberg, became villains in the public imagination. He was accused of hoarding food, of murdering Tams and Donner, of enjoying what he had to do to survive. None of these accusations were proven. The truth in the age of printing presses and dime novels was never the priority. The public loved extremes. They didn't want nuance. They wanted either martyrs or monsters. This made life after survival difficult. Every interview, every newspaper sketch, every fictional retelling reopened wounds. Some survivors tried to set the record straight. Virginia Reed, years later, published her own account. She begged future pioneers to avoid shortcuts and listen to those with experience. Others stayed silent, worn down by the weight of their memories and the world's fascination with them. By the late 19th century, the Donner Party had become folklore, campfire stories told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale taught to schoolchildren, a metaphor for poor planning. For hubris, for what happens when people trust the wrong advice, the Hastings cutoff became infamous, a synonym for fatal shortcuts. And over time, the true horror of the story, the cannibalism, was used to mask the deeper tragedy that the entire ordeal could have been prevented. That bad leadership, arrogant promises, and systemic inexperience killed more people than snow ever did. Yet there's something uniquely American. In how the tale persisted, it's not just a story of failure. It's a story of obsession with movement, with reinvention, with the fantasy of taming nature and destiny. The Donner Party was a mirror, reflecting not just desperation, but the myth of westward perfection cracking under its own weight. The truth is, there were no heroes, no villains, just humans making impossible choices. And while the snow melted and time marched forward, the question never truly faded. What would you have done? Today, the Donner Party stands as more than a footnote in American history. It's a symbol, distorted, debated, and deeply uncomfortable. Unlike other tales of pioneering grit, this one refuses to sit neatly in the gallery of noble westward expansion. It's a story that still bites. We remember the cannibalism, yes, but that was only the final act. The real legacy lies in everything that led to it. The illusion of shortcuts, the fatal power of poor leadership, the faith placed in maps drawn by dreamers instead of realists. The Donner Party exposed the fragility of the American dream when tested against the harsh indifference of nature. And yet, in that collapse, we also find something else: endurance. The survivors didn't just make it down from the mountains. They rebuilt, married, and had children. Some stayed in California. Others moved away to escape the whispers. A few even became quietly prosperous. Their lives weren't defined by what they had done to survive, but by the choice to keep living after it. But the cost of that survival is eternal. The site at Donner Lake still stands, preserved and somber. Visitors walk through pine trees and melting snow, reading plaques about hunger and courage. Tour guides speak in quiet tones. Historians argue over the details. Writers still can't leave the story alone, because the Donner Party asks questions that history usually avoids. What happens when every option left is the one you swore you'd never choose? What happens when the dream of paradise turns into a snowy tomb? And if survival is all that's left, does it still matter how you achieve it? There are no satisfying answers, just echoes and bones buried beneath the snow. In the end, the Donner Party reminds us that human strength is not measured in glory, but in resolve, not in conquest, but in the brutal, terrible choice to keep breathing, even when every comfort, law, and illusion of civilization has been stripped away. So we remember them, not just for what they did, but for what they endured. Not as legends or cautionary tales, but as people terrified, determined, flawed, and human. And in the Sierra winds, their story still whispers through the trees, forever frozen in time, forever unfinished. Wu Jiao was not born into royalty. She was born into something far more dangerous: ambition wrapped in silk. The year was 624 CE, and the Tang dynasty was still young, glowing with promise and poetry. Her father was a timber merchant, wealthy enough to provide his daughters with rare privileges, tutors, books, and the radical idea that a girl's mind could be just as sharp as any boy's sword. From an early age, Hu Zhao was different, while her peers learned embroidery and how to pour tea with humility. Wu studied politics, history, and literature. She was fascinated by strategy and stories of imperial rule. She didn't just read about powerful men, she imagined herself among them. By the time she turned 14, her beauty, wit, and education caught the attention of Emperor Taizong himself. She was summoned to the imperial palace and became one of the emperor's many concubines. At first glance, it might have seemed like a dead end. After all, she was ranked fairly low, a mere talented lady among dozens. But Wu had no intention of fading into the background. Even in a palace overflowing with silks and whispers, she stood out. She memorized the emperor's routines, his likes, his moods. She learned the art of silence, of knowing when to speak and when to vanish behind a curtain. But most importantly, she watched. She watched how power was wielded, and more importantly, how it was lost. And when Emperor Taizong fell ill, Wu Zhao didn't panic. She planned. Upon his death, she should have been sent to a Buddhist convent, her life effectively over. But fate, or more accurately, Wu's cunning, had other plans. She had already caught the eye of the emperor's son, Li Ji, the future Emperor Gaozong, and he hadn't forgotten her. What followed was the first in a long string of quiet revolutions. Wu Zhao wasn't just a concubine anymore. She was a student of power, and soon she'd be its master. The girl, once hidden behind a palace screen, would become the woman who ruled from the dragon throne. But her rise had only just begun, and the empire was not ready for what was coming when Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE. Palace protocol dictated Wu Zhao's next step with chilling clarity. She was to be sent to a convent and live out her days shaved, headed, and silent. Most former concubines accepted this fate with quiet resignation. Wu Zhao, however, was not most. Before Taizong's death, she had already begun a subtle and dangerous entanglement with his son Li Ji, the new Emperor Gaozong. Whether it was genuine affection or ruthless calculation, their bond survived the transition of power, and so barely a year after entering the convent, Wu Zhao returned, not as a cast-off widow, but as the emperor's secret consort. The Empress Wang, Gaozong's wife, had ironically orchestrated Wu's return. Hoping to distract the emperor from another rival concubine, she invited Wu Zhou back into the palace. She might as well have handed her the keys to the empire. Wu Zhao played her new role with chilling grace. She bore the emperor's sons, an advantage no rival could match. But she didn't just give him heirs, she gave him ideas. It wasn't long before she became his closest advisor, whispering thoughts that slowly rewrote the gears of state policy and court etiquette. Some said the emperor was in love. Others whispered he was bewitched. Either way, she was now indispensable. Then came the blood. The rivalry with Empress Wang and another favored concubine, Consort Xiao, escalated into a quiet war. In 654 CE, tragedy struck or was orchestrated. Wu Zhao's infant daughter died under suspicious circumstances. She accused Empress Wang of murder. What followed was swift and brutal. Wang and Xiao were deposed, imprisoned, and eventually mutilated. Empress Wang's limbs hacked off and her tongue removed. Her final cries, it was said, were like those of a pig being slaughtered. Wu Zhao was now empress, officially. This wasn't a rise. It was a coup disguised as destiny. Wu Zhao had moved from concubine to empress, not with armies, but with alliances, assassinations, and the steady erosion of her enemy's influence. She didn't just survive palace life. She bent it to her will. But she wasn't finished, not even close. She had tasted power. Now she wanted the throne itself, not beside the emperor, but above it. And for the first time in China's long and patriarchal history, that unthinkable dream would start to become reality by the late 60s. Empress Wu was no longer merely a consort who whispered advice from behind the screen. She had become the empire's silent puppeteer. Emperor Gaozong's health began to fail, his vision deteriorating, his strength waning. In his weakness, Wu Zhao found an opportunity. She stepped forward as his proxy, issuing edicts in his name, presiding over court meetings, even reviewing memorials meant for the emperor's eyes only. Ministers knew the truth, but dared not say it. China was now ruled by a woman. At first, Wu Zhao ruled cautiously. She supported Buddhism over the traditional Confucian order, using its doctrines to justify her presence in politics. After all, if the Buddha had once appeared as a woman, why couldn't a woman guide the empire? It was spiritual logic with political teeth. She restructured the bureaucracy, promoting officials based on merit rather than family name. This was revolutionary in a court dominated by aristocratic bloodlines. To her supporters, she was a reformer. To her enemies, She was a social arsonist, setting fire to centuries of tradition. Still, Wu played the long game. She never rushed the throne. Instead, she waited, removing rivals, gathering allies, and mastering the language of statecraft. She planted informants like seeds throughout the bureaucracy. She used the imperial secret police like pruning shears. Any official who opposed her found themselves demoted, exiled, or executed, all while she remained outwardly dutiful to the emperor. In 683, Gaozong died. The natural order should have restored male rule. Their son, Zhongzong, ascended the throne. But when he showed signs of independence, daring to appoint his in-laws to important positions, Wu Zhao struck. She demoted him and installed another son, Ruizong, one easier to control. Behind the throne, she ruled absolutely as Empress Dowager and Regent. It was the perfect disguise for authority, a mother protecting the empire in her son's name. But soon even the fiction of male rule began to chafe. Why hide anymore? The ministers grumbled. The court scribes whispered. China has never had a female emperor, they warned. It would be unnatural. Wu Zhao listened. Then she quietly began to prepare a new name, a new dynasty, and a new chapter in history where the emperor wore a crown of phoenixes, not dragons. She wasn't content to rule from the shadows. She was ready to claim the light. In 690 CE, Wu Zhao finally cast aside the veil. No more proxies, no more sons sitting on the throne with her hand behind their backs. She declared the end of the Tang dynasty and announced the birth of a new regime, the Zhou dynasty, named after a golden age of ancient Chinese history, carefully chosen to evoke legitimacy and virtue. She was no longer Empress Dowager Wu. She was Huangdi Wu Zhao, China's first and only female emperor. The court was stunned. Some scholars recoiled in outrage, citing Confucian texts that spoke of women as obedient, modest, and confined to the inner chambers. But Wu Zhao had already rewritten the rules. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, promoted commoners who owed their rise to her, and crushed dissent before it had time to take root to reinforce her mandate. She leaned heavily on Buddhism. Temples were built across the empire, proclaiming her as the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. One monk even discovered a scripture declaring that a woman would one day rule the world and bring universal peace. Conveniently, that woman was sitting on the throne. She had portraits painted of herself, seated on the throne with calm authority, and inscriptions carved in stone that praised her as divine monarch. In a patriarchal society, it was nothing short of heresy, and yet it worked. Wu Zhao governed with a mixture of steel and silk. She strengthened the civil service exam system, ensuring that bureaucrats were chosen by ability, not birthright. She implemented agricultural reforms, lowered burdens on farmers, and increased state revenue. Under her reign, the empire remained largely stable and prosperous. But her power came with a price. She relied on a secret police network that sniffed out dissent like incense smoke in a temple. Court intrigues intensified. Critics disappeared. Rumors of executions, forced suicides, and torture chambers circulated like dark incense behind palace walls. Even so, she ruled with an iron grace. She wore the dragon robe. She gave imperial audiences. She issued decrees under her own name. For 15 years, Wu Zhao wasn't just the most powerful woman in China. She was the most powerful person. She had climbed every rung of a ladder she was never meant to touch, and now she stood alone at the top. Ruling China as its only female emperor brought prestige, but it also made Wu Zhao the focal point of every grudge, fear, and wounded ego in the empire. She had rewritten tradition, defied Confucian order, and outmaneuvered generations of noblemen. And that meant one thing. Everyone in silk was watching her and waiting. The court seethed with quiet rebellion. Ministers who bowed by day conspired by candlelight at night. Even among her own children, there was no safety. The sons she had once used as pawns began to resent her absolute control. They wanted power, but Wu had taught them too well how dangerous ambition could be. She trusted none of them. To survive, Wu Zhao didn't just govern. She played a relentless game of psychological chess. Suspected conspirators were removed under vague charges. Trials were swift, confessions often forced, and executions public. Her enemies painted her as bloodthirsty, but in truth, she was surgical. This wasn't madness, it was a method. She created new ranks within the bureaucracy, titles that seemed grand but carried little power. It was her way of rewarding loyalty without handing over real control. She also elevated the status of women at court, placing female relatives and trusted concubines into positions that would have been unthinkable a generation before. Yet as the years wore on, her reliance on a few key figures began to cast shadows on her legacy. Two favorites in particular, the Zhang brothers, rose from court entertainers to political insiders. Handsome, charming, and decades younger, they quickly earned favor, and with it, influence. To her critics, this was scandalous. The emperor, once known for her piercing intellect and ruthless command, was now seen as a lonely woman clinging to youth through the company of fawning courtiers. Whispers of corruption and decadence began to spread, but those whispers couldn't erase her accomplishments. Under her rule, literacy expanded, civil service exams were reformed, and state infrastructure improved. She hadn't just ruled, she had governed effectively. Still, her health began to decline. Her grip on power, though still firm, was weakening, and behind her, vultures circled, eager for a return to normal. To a throne once again ruled by a man, Wu Zhao knew the end was approaching. The only question now was, would it come by illness or betrayal? By the early 70s, Wu Zhao was in her 70s, an advanced age for anyone, let alone an emperor. Her body grew frail, her strength waned, and yet her mind remained sharp, ever alert to the shifting winds of court politics. She still ruled, but now from a reclining couch behind golden screens hidden from view, and those closest to her began circling like wolves, sensing weakness. Her reliance on the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, became a source of ridicule and resentment. Once charming favorites, they were now viewed as corrupt sycophants who manipulated imperial decisions for their own gain. Ministers who had long tolerated their presence began to plot. In 705 CE, the palace finally snapped. A group of senior officials and generals launched a swift coup. It wasn't bloody. It didn't need to be. The empress was surrounded, her allies captured, and the Zhang brothers were summarily executed, their heads displayed to the court as a signal. The phoenix's wings had been clipped. Faced with overwhelming pressure and deteriorating health, Wu Zhao had no choice but to abdicate. She was forced to step down and restore her son Zhongzong to the throne, the same son she had previously removed for daring to think independently. She retreated into retirement, her once vast court reduced to a small entourage. And yet, even in abdication, she retained her title as emperor and continued to exert some influence behind closed doors. China may have changed the name on its throne, but the echo of Wu Zhao's reign still lingered in every policy, every law, every shaken official, afraid of another woman with ideas. She died later that same year. No grand tomb inscription, no flowery epitaph. Her name was quietly removed from official histories. The Tang dynasty erased her as thoroughly as they could, as if her reign had been a bad dream they preferred not to discuss. But history, like Wu Zhao herself, is difficult to silence. For decades afterward, poets and scholars argued about her. Was she a usurper or a visionary? A tyrant or a reformer? A murderer or a savior of the state? What is certain is this: she broke every rule the empire tried to write for her, and for 15 years she didn't just defy history, she became it. After her death in 705 CE, the Tang court moved swiftly to erase Wu Zhao's unprecedented reign. Official histories were rewritten. Her reforms were attributed to her male successors. Her name, carved into records and temples, was scratched out, replaced with safer, more familiar male names. Yet despite the state's efforts, Wu Zhao refused to vanish. The people remembered her. Scholars couldn't ignore her. Foreign emissaries continued to speak of the female emperor who once ruled the greatest empire on earth, and in a strange twist of fate, it was the very scholars and historians tasked with minimizing her legacy who ensured its survival. You can erase a name, but not a reign that shaped a generation. Her accomplishments were undeniable. She had elevated Buddhism to new prominence, making it a central pillar of imperial legitimacy. She had restructured the civil service, making exams more meritocratic and reducing aristocratic nepotism. She had defended the empire's borders, launched successful military campaigns, and kept internal rebellion largely in check, an achievement most male rulers could only hope for. And for women, Wu Zhao's reign was a brief, radiant constellation in a dark sky of subjugation. She appointed women to key positions, funded female education, and offered unprecedented access to the levers of power. Her rule became a mythic precedent, proof that a woman could not only survive the palace, but dominate it. Still, her legacy is tangled. Later Confucian historians painted her as a monster in makeup, a femme fatale who seduced her way to power and bathed her court in blood. Stories of her cruelty were exaggerated, her lovers multiplied, her ruthlessness elevated to near demonic proportions. It was easier to villainize her than to admit she had outperformed many of her male predecessors. But modern historians have begun to balance the scales. Today, Wu Zhao is recognized not just as a powerful woman, but as one of the most effective rulers in Chinese history, male or female. Her reign, complex and contradictory, remains a masterclass in statecraft, political survival, and ideological manipulation. She ruled in a time that said she should be silent. She conquered a system built to crush her, and in the ashes of her erasure, her name still burns, quiet, powerful, and unforgettable. To understand Wu Zhao's reign is to understand the China she shaped, not just through edicts and executions, but through culture, ideology, and identity. Her rule wasn't just a political anomaly, it was a civilizational pivot point. For one, she redefined what it meant to be imperial. Traditional emperors surrounded themselves with Confucian scholars and war generals. Wu Zhao, in contrast, built her court around Buddhist monks, scholars from humble backgrounds, and fiercely loyal officials who owed their careers to her vision of meritocracy. This fundamentally altered the power structure of the Tang dynasty. Under Wu Zhao, the civil service exams became more inclusive and rigorous. This empowered scholars from poorer, non-noble families, a dramatic shift away from the aristocratic monopolies that had dominated since the Han Dynasty. In doing so, she laid the groundwork for a more dynamic, educated bureaucracy that would endure long after her death. Culturally, she sparked a golden age of Buddhist art and architecture. Temples, pagodas, and colossal statues were erected in her name and image at Longmen Grottoes. A massive statue of Vairocana Buddha bears unmistakable features resemble Wu herself. Regal, calm, and all-seeing, these were not just religious offerings, they were political monuments. Each structure whispered the same radical message. A woman could embody cosmic order. She also changed the language of rulership. Wu Zhou introduced dozens of new Chinese characters into official use, some to express abstract virtues, others designed specifically to glorify her rule. Most of these characters vanished after her reign, but the audacity of crafting a new script to describe a new regime speaks volumes about her vision. Perhaps most revolutionary was her manipulation of gender roles. By portraying herself as both mother and sovereign, she fused the intimate and the imperial. She didn't challenge masculinity directly. She absorbed it into her persona. She was at once the nurturing protector and the ruthless enforcer, the dragon and the phoenix, the emperor and the empress. Her empire was not perfect. Dissent was punished harshly. Trust was a rare currency, but it functioned, evolved, and expanded under her. And that, despite centuries of resistance to her legacy, cannot be denied. Wu Zhao didn't just rule the Tang dynasty, she remodeled it. Wu Zhao died over 1,300 years ago, and yet the echo of her reign still ripples through China's cultural memory, a haunting melody of brilliance, brutality, and bold defiance. While her name was once scraped from stone and banished from official annals, time is a way of unearthing what history tries to bury. In the centuries that followed, she became a paradox. In popular folklore, she was portrayed as everything from a cruel seductress to a divine ruler. Opera troupes dramatized her life, sometimes portraying her as a tragic heroine, sometimes as a ruthless tyrant. She was demonized, sanctified, misunderstood, and yet never forgotten. No woman in Chinese history has ever matched her climb or her crown. Others held power as dowagers or regents, but none ever declared themselves emperor. None dared to remake dynasties, rewrite language, or stand alone atop the world's most powerful throne. And the legacy of that fact that she broke the unbreakable rule continues to inspire debate. To some, she remains a cautionary tale, the danger of ambition unbound, of femininity and armor. But to others, especially modern historians, feminists, and political thinkers, she is something else entirely, a symbol of resilience, a case study in raw political genius, a monument to the cost and consequence of leading when you were never meant to. Even today, Wu Zhao is more than a historical figure. She's a mirror. In her rise, you see the gears of systemic injustice turning, and in her reign, the moment they were jammed. She didn't just defy expectations, she obliterated them. And yet she also paid the price of greatness. Her legacy remains clouded by moral ambiguity. She used fear as much as fairness. Her enemies died not just in disgrace, but sometimes without trial. Their voices are lost to history. Her compassion was selective, her justice strategic. She was not a saint, but she was never trying to be. Wu Zhao ruled not to be liked, but to survive, and in surviving, she made history. And so, she remains, the woman emperor who rose from the shadows of concubinage, who walked into a world that said no and answered with a throne. In a land of dragons, she crowned herself the phoenix, and in that flame she burned her name into eternity. In the ancient world, a road wasn't just a convenience, it was a declaration of power. The moment a ruler ordered a road to be carved through forest, desert, or mountain, it wasn't about ease of travel. It was about control. Roads were the empire in motion. Unlike rivers or oceans, which nature dictated, roads were human impositions. They cut through geography, tethered distant outposts to capitals, and reminded everyone, from merchant to rebel, that civilization had reached. Good arty meant troops could move fast, taxes could be collected efficiently, and goods from the frontier could be brought to the heart of the empire. The earliest known roads go back to Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BCE, these weren't paved highways, but compacted dirt paths used for carts and trade caravans. Even then, societies realized something crucial. When people move, ideas, goods, and influence move with them, and whoever builds the path controls the flow. In ancient Persia, the royal Ardi stretched over 1,500 miles from Sardis to Susa. It had way stations, rest areas, and royal couriers, who could gallop across the empire in record time. Herodotus claimed a message could travel its full length in just 7 days. That speed wasn't just impressive, it was intimidating. It meant that the king's voice could reach every corner of the empire in days, not weeks. But it was the Romans who perfected the road as an imperial instrument. They built over 50,000 miles of stone-paved roads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Straight, durable, and astonishingly well-engineered, these roads were designed not for beauty, but for efficiency. Marching legions, grain shipments, imperial messengers each depended on that stone beneath their feet. Roman roads often started with military purposes in mind, but their civilian impact was just as transformative. Farmers could get their goods to markets. Travelers could cross regions safely. Cities became linked not just by politics, but by stone and sweat. In every civilization that mattered, the road was never just about transportation. It was about transformation, because to build a road was to reshape the land. And with it, reshape the power that ruled it. If the ancient world had an engineering superpower, it was Rome. And their greatest tool wasn't just the aqueduct or the arch, it was the road. Roman roads weren't just pathways, they were the bones of an empire. The phrase "all roads lead to Rome" wasn't metaphorical, it was logistical. The Romans built over 50,000 miles of roads. Stone laid, expertly drained, and arrow straight. They connected Britain to Egypt, the Rhine to the Danube, and every strategic military outpost in between. These roads made the empire feel smaller, faster, and more manageable. Roman engineers followed a formula. First, they chose a route, not necessarily the easiest, but often the straightest. Then came surveying, using tools like the groma for right angles and distance. Once the path was set, they began excavation. Roman road. was built in layers like a cake of conquest. The bottom layer, Statumen, was made of large stones. Above that came Rudis, a mix of crushed stone and lime. Next was the nucleus, a layer of compacted sand or gravel. Finally, the Summum Dorsum, a paved top of interlocking stone slabs, often crowned in the center for water runoff. The result was a road that could withstand centuries of weather, hooves, and sandals. Some are still in use today, but engineering was only half the story. Roman roads came with infrastructure, mile markers, rest stops, and way stations called mansions, where officials and messengers could rest and resupply. The Cursus Publicus, Rome's courier system, used these roads to move messages across the empire at astonishing speed, nearly 50 miles a day in some cases, and the roads moved more than mail. They moved legions, a rebellion in Gaul, a skirmish in Judea. Roman troops could march hundreds of miles faster than any enemy expected. Roads became extension of Rome's military muscle, silent, solid, and always advancing. But with soldiers came settlers, and with settlers came cities. Roads encouraged trade migration and the spread of Roman law, language, and architecture. They were arteries pumping culture as well as conquest. For Rome, a road wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity, a symbol, a message carved in stone that said Rome is here. And wherever Rome built, the world changed beneath their feet. While Rome built roads in stone, the Inca Empire built them in the sky, stretching over 25,000 miles. The Capac Nyan, the Great Inca Road system, was a marvel of Andean engineering. It tied together one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth, connecting deserts, jungles, and mountains that soared past 13,000 feet. And the Inca did it all without the wheel, without draft animals beyond the llama, and without metal tools in the European sense. This wasn't just a road system, it was the spine of an empire. At the heart of it all was Cusco, the Inca capital. Radiating out like spokes on a sun wheel, the roads linked provincial centers, military outposts, agricultural hubs, and sacred sites. The most famous stretch is the Inca Trail, which winds its way to Machu Picchu, but that was just one thread in a vast imperial web. The roads varied in size and construction. In the lowlands, they were wide and paved with stone. In the high mountains, they were narrow paths cut into cliffs, sometimes no more than a foot wide. Where rivers ran, the Incas built rope suspension bridges using woven grass, strong enough to support travelers and caravans of llamas. These bridges had to be remade yearly, a community ritual that still survives in parts of Peru today. There were no wheeled carts. All transport was by foot or by llama, but the Incas had something even more efficient. Shaska relay runners. These messengers sprinted between tambos or rest stations built every few miles. Messages, food, and even fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor in Cusco within days. This system allowed the empire to function with astonishing speed, despite having no written script, but the roads were also spiritual. Many followed Sikhs, sacred lines that radiated from Cusco to shrines and mountains. Travel wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Each step reinforced imperial order and religious harmony. The Capac Nyan wasn't a Roman-style conquest machine. It was a tether, a way to hold a vertical empire together. From snow-capped peaks to coastal deserts, the roads made unity possible. And though much of it is gone today, some stretches still endure stones fitted without mortar. Still carrying footsteps after 500 years, the Incas didn't just conquer the Andes. They stitched it together, one path at a time. Centuries before Rome and far from the Andean peaks, another empire stitched together its vast territory with stone and strategy, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And at its heart ran the Royal Road, a 1,500-mile engineering triumph stretching from Sardis in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, to Susa, one of the Persian capitals. Commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BC, the Royal RD wasn't just a way to move goods. It was a political artery, a demonstration of imperial sophistication, and one of the earliest true long-distance highways in recorded history. The Persians didn't invent roads, but they standardized them, militarized them, and made them the foundation of bureaucracy. Their engineers scouted routes that balanced terrain with directness, avoiding swamps and scaling mountains when necessary. The result was a surprisingly smooth and fast connection across a continent-spanning empire. Herodotus wrote that royal messengers could cross the entire royal Ardi in 7 days, a journey that would have taken a regular traveler about 90 days. How? The system of relay stations. Every 15-18 miles, there were posting stations with fresh horses and supplies. Couriers would switch horses and continue riding at top speed, a system that prefigured the Pony Express by over 2,000 years. But these roads weren't only for messengers. Merchants, military units, diplomats, and tax collectors used them constantly. The Royal Road helped knit together a multi-ethnic empire that included Greeks, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. It made possible something extraordinary in the ancient world: central oversight of distant provinces. Road guards ensured safety, and caravanserais provided shelter and provisions. The entire system relied on maintenance and order, two things the Persian bureaucracy excelled at. Road crews were deployed to fix damage, and tolls were sometimes collected at river crossings or mountain passes. The Persians also pioneered road markers and milestones, tools for measuring distance and ensuring consistency across regions. These practices would echo later in Rome and Byzantium. The Royal Road didn't survive the fall of Persia intact, but its influence lingered. Alexander the Great used it to invade the empire. The Romans later expanded upon the concept. Even today, modern highways follow parts of its ancient route. It proved one powerful idea: an empire isn't ruled by a sword alone. It's ruled by the speed of a message and the strength of the road it travels. While the Romans were laying stone in Europe and the Incas were carving trails through the Andes, another empire was quietly building a road network that would shape the world in a different way. Han Dynasty, China. The roads didn't just connect cities. They stitched together a civilization and fueled the rise of one of the most legendary trade systems in human history, the Silk Road. Under the Han Dynasty, especially during the reign of Emperor Wu, or 141 to 87 BCE, roads became a tool for expansion and control. The government poured resources into constructing and maintaining long-distance routes that extended from the imperial capital of Chang'an into Central Asia. These roads weren't just for merchants, they were vital military and administrative arteries. Unlike Roman roads, Han roads weren't uniformly stone-paved. Many were hard-packed dirt or gravel, occasionally reinforced with planks in muddy regions or stone slabs in high-traffic areas. But what they lacked in uniform engineering, they made up for in scale and organization. The postal relay system, known as the Ichuan, was remarkably advanced. Stations were placed at regular intervals, complete with fresh horses and accommodations for government messengers. This allowed imperial decrees and tax records to travel across thousands of miles with surprising speed. These roads supported not just governance, but diplomacy and trade. Envoys like Zhang Qian, who journeyed westward into Central Asia, opened up contact with cultures as far as Persia and India. Silk, jade, paper, and spices flowed outward. In return, China received horses, glassware, and new agricultural ideas. Security was essential. The Han invested heavily in maintaining military garrisons along the routes, especially near the Gansu Corridor, a narrow, windswept strip of land that acted as a gateway between China and the West. Watchtowers, beacon mounds, and walled settlements dotted the road, creating a lattice of imperial presence. Culturally, the road system enabled the spread of Confucianism, Buddhism, and administrative practices across diverse regions. Travelers, monks, soldiers, and merchants moved ideas along with goods, shaping a unified identity that would last long beyond the Han. Han roads weren't built to impress, they were built to endure. And while many vanished beneath later cities, or were reclaimed by dust and desert, their legacy remained. Because through these roads, China didn't just defend its borders, it opened a door to the world. The ancient Greeks are rarely celebrated for their roads. They didn't build grand highways like the Romans or stretch vast networks like the Persians. But what they did build, though more modest in scale, reveals how roads could shape not only commerce and war, but culture, religion, and identity. Greece's rugged mountainous terrain made Ardi. Building is difficult and expensive, so instead of imperial highways, The Greeks developed a patchwork of stone-paved local routes, often connecting city-states rather than unifying a vast empire. These roads followed natural terrain and were typically narrow, just wide enough for pack animals or chariots. Yet despite their simplicity, they played a crucial role in the Greek world. One of the most famous routes was the Sacred Way from Athens to Eleusis, used during the Eleusinian Mysteries, religious festivals dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Each year, thousands of initiates walked this road in a grand procession, chanting hymns and carrying offerings. For them, the road was not just a path, it was a rite of passage, journey from the world of the living into mystery and transformation. Another iconic route was the Panhellenic Road, leading to Delphi, the home of the oracle of Apollo pilgrims, kings and philosophers alike. Took this winding arty through mountains and valleys to consult the oracle. Along the way were treasuries, shrines, and inscribed stones, forming a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. But Greek roads weren't only sacred. They were used by soldiers, philosophers, and traders. Think of Xenophon's Anabasis, describing the long retreat of Greek mercenaries through Persia, a brutal R.D. bound odyssey. Or imagine Socrates, who often walked from the Agora to the Academy or the Lyceum to teach under the open sky, his feet tracing worn paths of dialogue and debate. What set Greek roads apart wasn't their engineering, it was their integration into daily life. They weren't built by emperors to display dominance. They emerged organically, shaped by marketplaces, sanctuaries, and social rituals, and through them, ideas traveled just as fast as soldiers or carts. Philosophy, theater, democracy, even Olympic athletes, they all moved on dusty, narrow roads that wound through olive groves and city gates. Simple as they were, Greek roads carried the weight of a civilization that changed the world, not by force, but by thought. In ancient India, roads weren't just channels of commerce, they were arteries of spiritual life. Imperial governance and cultural exchange from the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BCE to later Gupta rule, Indian civilizations developed a remarkably organized RD network that connected fertile river valleys, coastal ports, trade towns, and holy cities. The most transformative period for ancient Indian roads came under Emperor Ashoka, the Buddhist monarch who ruled most of the subcontinent around 268,232 BCE. After renouncing violence following the bloody Kalinga War, Ashoka turned to public welfare, and roads became a central feature of that transformation. Ashoka ordered the construction and expansion of roads across his empire. These weren't just dirt paths. They were deliberately engineered routes, often lined with trees for shade, wells for water, and rest houses for travelers. He placed inscribed stone pillars along the roads, not to mark distances, but to declare edicts urging compassion, truthfulness, and religious tolerance. It was governed by visibility. The most famous of these roads ran from Pataliputra, modern-day Patna, to the northwest frontier, connecting the Ganges Plain to present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. This stretch later became part of the northern trade route that would evolve into the Silk Road. Linking India to China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman world, Indian roads carried more than goods. They carried faiths and philosophies. Buddhist monks walked these roads to spread their teachings. Hindu pilgrims used them to journey between sacred rivers and temples. Even Jain sages took to these routes in quiet contemplation. The roads became bridges between ideas. Trade flourished from the eastern coast. Goods like spices, textiles, ivory, and gems traveled inland and outward, reaching Roman ports and Central Asian markets. Roads linked urban centers like Taxila, Ujjain, and Varanasi, each a hub of commerce and scholarship. Though many Indian roads were not paved like Roman ones, they were maintained seasonally, especially before monsoon rains. Engineers used gravel, wood planks, and packed earth, often elevated slightly to prevent flooding, what made India's ancient RD. The system wasn't brute force, it was plurality. Roads served kings, farmers, saints, and scholars alike. They didn't just connect empires, they connected worldviews. And in that blend of purpose, part political, part spiritual, part economic, India paved not just roads, but pathways to influence that would stretch far beyond its borders. Ancient roads weren't just flat paths stretching across the land. They were feats of engineering that overcame rivers, ravines, and rugged terrain. To build effective roads, civilizations had to master the art of bridge building, drainage, and durable construction. The Romans were pioneers in bridge engineering. Their roads often crossed vast rivers using stone arch bridges, structures that could support heavy loads and endure centuries. The Ponte Milvio in Rome and the Alcantara Bridge in Spain are prime examples. The Roman arch used keystones and carefully cut stones, distributing weight perfectly. Their bridges weren't just practical, they were symbols of imperial power, inviting awe and respect. But the Romans weren't alone. The Incas, faced with wild rivers cutting through Andean gorges, built rope suspension bridges crafted from woven grasses and vines. These bridges were lightweight, but incredibly strong, rebuilt annually by local communities and rituals still practiced today. Crossing these bridges was not just a physical challenge, but a cultural one, binding communities to the land and to each other. In ancient China, engineers developed beam bridges and pontoon bridges. The famous Zhaozhou Bridge, built during the Sui dynasty, completed in 605 CE, is the world's oldest open spandrel stone segmental arch bridge. It combined aesthetic grace with remarkable engineering, allowing heavy traffic to cross the Jing River for centuries. Drainage was equally critical. Roman roads were crowned in the center to shed rainwater quickly, with ditches on either side. In the wet and monsoon-prone lands of India and Southeast Asia, roads were often elevated on causeways or filled with gravel layers to prevent washouts. Some empires even built roads with multiple layers of materials, compacted soil, stones, gravel, and paving slabs to ensure durability. Beyond bridges and drainage, the creation of way stations and mile markers along ancient roads provided travelers with rest, supplies, and orientation, early versions of highway. Rest stops. These engineering achievements didn't just facilitate movement, they shaped economies, warfare, and culture. A bridge could mean the difference between an army crossing into enemy lands or being stopped cold. A well-maintained RD could mean the survival of a city through trade and communication. Ultimately, the engineering behind ancient roads was an expression of human ingenuity, a testament to how societies adapted to and reshaped their environments to move people, goods, and ideas across vast landscapes. Throughout history, ancient roads were more than mere pathways. They were the lifelines that allowed empires to thrive, expand, and endure. Roads connected distant cities and remote villages, enabling trade, communication, and cultural exchange that defined civilizations. Empires understood that without efficient roads, armies could not move quickly, governors could not enforce law, and merchants could not prosper. Roads shaped economic hubs, encouraged urban growth, and even influenced the spread of religions and philosophies. The Silk Road, the Roman Via Appia, the Incan Capacnian, all carried more than just goods. They carried ideas and identities. The maintenance of these roads required vast bureaucracies and dedicated labor forces, reflecting the organizational prowess of empires like Rome, Persia, China, and the Incas. Roads became a measure of an empire's reach and stability. When roads were kept in good repair, empires flourished. When neglected, regions drifted into isolation, rebellion, or decline. But roads also symbolize human ambition, the desire to connect, control, and communicate across vast spaces. They show how early engineers and leaders understood geography not just as a barrier, but as a canvas to reshape. Today, many ancient roads lie beneath modern highways, while others remain as archaeological treasures. They remind us that the infrastructure we often take for granted was once a monumental achievement, paved with sweat, stone, wood, and ingenuity. The legacy of ancient roads is alive in every journey we take, every letter sent, and every trade route that links our globalized world. They are the silent architects of empire, culture, and civilization. In essence, the story of ancient roads is the story of humanity itself, ever on the move, building bridges, both literal and metaphorical, across time and space.